I really enjoyed a conversation with Aspasia and Javier on Javier's concept of negative pragmatism as it relates to relationships. And so I was thinking about like something that came up was this idea of being able to speak openly, basically, right? Like, sure, realistically speaking, you can't do this like with every single person you know, nor should you. But there are certain people who you may, like she said it, how did she say it? Like you'll let that person see all of you, or like not just half of you, but all of you. Like you'll let them hear more of you, or all of you, or whatever. Something like this. It was a great point, and really beautifully said. And I guess I was just mulling over um, something that I find difficult to discern, which is like when is it speaking to like allow that vulnerability and like face your fear of being vulnerable with the other person and like let them hear more from you that maybe you wouldn't share with everybody, or you're afraid to share because, oh, what if they don't like what I'm saying, or what if they react X way or Y way. um One, is it like that versus um like verbally processing in a way that's like anxious, like you're just talking because you want like to be affirmed, and like at the end of the day, like there's nothing the person can ever like really say to prove it to you. But it will kind of feel nice, like the fact that it will feel nice, like some little classic example. Let me just say really quick, like okay, this is an example that comes to my mind where that I've heard other like women talk about, like with their husband or their partner, like, do you love me, do you love me, do you love me, and then, and then the guy's like, yeah, I do, like, that. And actually made me think of Jesus, right? I'm like, was Jesus having like was he having like a woman moment when he was like, Peter, do you love me, do you love me? But anyways, the point of the matter is like that's a thing, right? And in a way, is that being like raw and vulnerable and like facing your fear to talk, or is that just like needing affirmation about something that but you just aren't feeling it for whatever reason? And so in that way, like you might be speaking out of anxiety, and I'm not sure if it like that type of verbal processing, I think, is sometimes not helpful, and not like it's just that it's like hard to satiate it, right? Because you kind of keep on wanting to ask it and ask it and ask it. And also it's like sometimes asking that to want to make sure everything's okay, make sure everything's okay, right? But it's like that's sort of like, it's a fear, but is that you being afraid to be vulnerable, or is that a fear about everything being okay, which then it was okay, but now that you're like harping on it, it's not okay. So, like your thing you say, Daniel, like, what you fear is what comes unto you. So anyways, this is what I've been thinking about since I listened to that wonderful conversation. So, and hello to everybody else, and thank you for letting me share.
Delightful. Well, thank you. Well, Cadell, Philip, Yuri, it's wonderful to see you today. It's a complete pleasure. And everyone, the Philosophy of Right class is starting on May 18th. And it's going to be amazing because the Philosophy of Right is freaking outstanding. So it's good to see all of you. I think the question of, if I were to put it very generally, the difference between fear and anxiety. Like, when are you facing a fear versus when are you speaking out of anxiety, right? That seems to be a really tough tension to figure out, and it seems to be a very big deal. And there's Mr. Rivera right there. Rivera, good to see you. It's a pleasure, sir. I hope you're doing well. I like the guitar background. You need to be in a Dave Matthews band. And I appreciated your conversation with Aspasia. Aspasia is tremendous. And so when we're talking about, Michelle was mentioning this idea of verbal processing. When there's some verbal processing that's kind of out of an anxiousness, where you're just speaking and you're processing, but you're also looking for affirmation. But what is the difference between that and, say, facing fear? What is the difference between acting out of anxiety versus facing a fear? And I think that's a really big distinction. I think, like, last week we were talking about the shades of doing nothing, the difference between thoughtlessness, boredom, and daydreaming, where there's a form of boredom that's necessary to be pulled out of busyness into action, as Chetan was saying in the Hannah Ardenson, and then I'll pass it to Philip. And then there's a kind of daydreaming that is the capacity to have nothing going on, but there's a certain dwelling activity that pulls you out of busyness into a kind of action. So that's very important. Another question that seems to be a very interesting analysis of different shades is, what's the difference between maybe nervousness, fear, anxiety? Because, if I'm in a conversation and I'm really nervous that people are upset with me, I could say, hey, John, are you okay? Are you okay? Are you okay? And John's like, why do you keep asking that? Hey, man, I was, it was really hard for me to ask you that. And I can frame it as facing fear. I can frame it as a courageous ask to kind of keep asking them, are they okay? But that doesn't actually seem to be the same as facing a fear, such as, for example, quitting the job that you know you should quit and you've been delaying it for a really long time. And yet we as human subjects can frame the nervous, anxious, looking for affirmation as facing fear, right? And that actually may be, to play on a little of the negative pragmatism, an example of a kind of trying to determine shades of activity that you can't really optimize, because this time the judgment may be this was facing fear versus anxiety, but the next time it could be different, next time it could be different, and you never know what the outcome is going to be ahead of time. So determining those different shades, I think, is interesting. But let me give it to Philip and Javier Rivera. Mr. Thomas Jochen, it is good to see you. Philip, it is good to see you.
You too, my man. And Hondo P, as far as like the singularity of each case, like, let me see if I can take some of Goodell talked about Trunkpa, and I don't know how to say his name, but it's something like Nintakan, right? So one of them was like this dude that was like, yo, let's just go as hard as we can, right? So in order to figure out how to process, maybe the person has to hear themselves doing it a million times to just be like, oh, I do this thing. And then be like, oh, maybe I could do something differently. Versus the sort of, let me find whatever, some kind of mindfulness practice so that each time it comes up, Plato about to hit his servant or whatever, he stands there with his, fist up for 24 hours and is like, oh, I can restructure my central nervous system this way. I think like part of it is becoming interested in motivation as such, and then I think wherever the person is, then maybe the best thing to do is some kind of psychiatry, some kind of psychoanalysis, just to kind of like be like, hey, why do I do this? And I also think, I wonder your thoughts on this, Daniel, because there's this big debate about, there's talk about free will and stuff. And a lot of people will go with like well, we don't even have willpower. And a part of me sometimes is like, okay, yeah, big picture, sure. But sometimes if it's like to get yourself out of bed, barring some catatonic state, like we can push ourselves a little bit. Maybe it's like a Richard Thaler type nudge. So I wonder how often it is that you'll be in this conversation and someone is processing something, and it's like, is it possible for you to create a container such that this doesn't overflow? And if they're like, no, then it's like, well, speak on then. And if they're like, okay, I think I can just like sit here quietly, then you might start, kind of entering towards new relations with this person, because maybe on some level you're the person who enables that type of logorrhea.
No, that's a wonderful comment, Philip. And Steve, it is good to see you, sir. I hope you're doing well. If you ever want to speak, feel free to raise your hand. Steve is a tremendous running coach, and I've had a wonderful time with exchanges at Voicecraft with him. And Mr. Jochen noticed that I matched my cup with my shirt. How did you know? How did you know? Your attention to detail is overwhelming. I really appreciate that. I'll pass it to Javier and Yuri. I think this question, I think it's very interesting on the idea of kind of how I do think conversation is a unique space by which to examine the question of free will and determination, because I have no idea what you're going to say before you say it. And I can feel myself being forced to confront something unexpected, which in a funny way actually suggests that something has been taken like freedom. Because like, for example, if I come up to you and say, hey, do you want to go to the movies? And you don't, you feel yourself, oh crap, I might piss Daniel off and I have to tell him I don't want to. You kind of feel your freedom is gone. right? But then if I ask you, do you have freedom outside of a situation where you feel it taken? It's like, oh, I don't know, maybe it's all determination or something like that. And I think what's interesting is there is something to be said of, is in conversation, one of the things that we can do almost as an act of being there for the other is to provide a container where what a person is saying is not something that kind of takes control of them and gets a life of their own, right? Like some people get talking like, oh, I can't stop myself. And like there's an act of love and being like, actually, I'm going to contain it. No, you don't have to go down that like crazy land. You don't have to go to cuckoo land today. I'm going to contain it. Now there's an act of love in that. Makes me think, I think it was Thomas Mann on his book on Faust, on this idea of response to pride, very nice, Sherry, is that he said there's something demonic about music because it possesses you and it feels you like carrying it. You know, he's playing on his book on Dr. Faust. There's something like that in conversation. Like everyone right now has no choice but to hear what I'm saying. And they can't predict it. It's just constantly happening, right? And there's an act of like, there's something unloving if I just start saying like terrible things like about y'all. Like, I didn't ask for that. And I kind of trusted you not to start talking about, our private lives. Why are you doing that? Right. And then there's also a kind of trust in I'm going to surprise you with something. And then I trust that you will catch it in a manner that receives it in love and then also keeps me from being pulled into something. So it's interesting how in conversation, there's almost this constant feeling of a freedom that is unrolling, that then is being caught to keep it from going too far or is being received. I think that language of container is very, very interesting. And then I think maybe there's something about anxiety is what happens when there's no facing of fear to stop it. Like, is anxiety what finds itself going and unable to stop that can only be stopped by someone in the conversation or yourself facing fear and kind of the courage? Because I'm not sure. I'll have to think. But let me give it to Javier and then Yuri. Mr. Rivera, I hope you're well today, sir.
Good, I'm well. All right, so I'm going to throw... I already kind of threw it at Jockin, but he hasn't had time to respond yet. So I've been thinking about negative pragmatism again, and I think this could give a kind of short circuit to this problem between what you're trying to identify between, like, is this nervousness, is this anxiety, are we facing our fear? So here's one speculation that I have about negative pragmatism. My hunch now is that I don't think we can start off with being negatively pragmatic. I think that negative pragmatism can only emerge from the point of failure from being pragmatic. So, for example, the anxiety example or the nervousness example that you gave, that person that's like, okay, I'm nervous, I should check to see if the person like received the message well. That's, in some sense, that's kind of being pragmatic, right? Like, you need to make sure that your message landed correctly. Like, was everything understood? But then the person says something like, nah, man, I'm good. Like, you're good. But the person still feels nervous, right? So now they're like realizing that they're annoying this guy by constantly asking like, hey, did that land well? So here's the part where negative pragmatism would kick in. It's when the person starts realizing that doesn't work anymore. But the other part of this issue is you've exhausted all possibilities of behaving in this way. Like, you've exhausted all possibilities of trying to mitigate whatever you're feeling between this person. Like, it's just not working. Whatever is happening, whatever you're trying to do is just not working. And so at this point, you just don't know what to do. And I think it's at this point that negative pragmatism kicks in. It's when you don't know what to do that negative pragmatism would say, just keep showing up, right? Keep showing up, and maybe you will encounter something, right? And so with this maybe of encountering something, you might realize that you don't have to actually check up on this guy, right? And then now you fall back into a pragmatic position where you start realizing that actually the most efficient way to deal with this person is just don't ask. He doesn't even take offense to anything I'm saying. So that means that the negative pragmatic position is always a temporal position that breaks the stasis of a pragmatic position. Basically reveals that your pragmatism was an ideal, but you didn't know it yet. But you have to go through this negative pragmatism to realize that your pragmatic position was an ideal in itself. And then now it leaves you open to a possibility of an encounter. And you know, and you can either discover a couple, those encounters can go several ways. I haven't gone, you know, up through all those, but the encounter can go in several ways in terms of you fall back again into a pragmatic position where you realize like, okay, I don't need to say anything. The guy, you know, does everything fine. Or you start realizing like, you know, maybe I am just nervous and this doesn't act like my nervousness doesn't actually correspond with my perceived reactions of him, you know. So there's many ways I could go, but yeah, that's my me throwing it in the wild right now.
We love when things are thrown in the wild, and then I'll pass it to you. It's very interesting because as you're speaking, I was thinking a bit about, is it something where we need to be able to make commitments without goals per se? Now, like you commit to say being a writer, but you don't have any goals of what that means. Now, goals are not necessarily bad. It's when they slip into expectations. For example, I had a goal to get back from Sam's today before 2:30 because I knew I had to be at the net. Was that a bad goal? No, but it was a reasonable, given that I love seeing you wonderful people. But there's something about goals that can turn into expectations that then lead to melancholy or deconstruction. So the ability to say, can I commit to something? I choose to do this, but I have no goals of what it means or expectations what it means. That seems to be, and maybe there's a difference between pragmatism and stewardship, like being a steward of a land, steward or something. Like we need to steward things, like you steward a garden, but you don't have any expectations of what grow. Do you steward commitment? And I think it also just makes me think, Julian Benda, in his book, The Treason of the Intellectual, warned that colleges in the 1920s were no longer spaces of defending the useless, is what he said. There was no more, the whole point of education is to defend the useless. And if it didn't do that, it would be controlled by technocrats, pragmatists, scientists, and all of that, and it would become very self-destructive. And there's a sense in which the only way to be free is uselessness. And he's kind of talking about leisure and all of these different things. Because if everything you do has to be justified in terms of use, then you are always already captured and can't have a line of flight. And it makes me think, you know, Nietzsche in book 5 of The Gay Science is very critical of pragmatism. He's like, you know, because you're deciding what you're going to do according to what's practical. And there's something about the need of commitment without a goal, and thus it is useless because what it may blossom cannot be predicted ahead of time. And I think conversations actually kind of replicate that, right? You commit to doing the conversation even if you don't know what's going to emerge or how to optimize it and et cetera, so forth. But I'll pass it to Yuri and Mr. Jockin. Yuri, it is good to see you. I enjoyed our conversation last week, and thank you for being here, sir. It's a treat.
Thank you for having me. So I have a few thoughts here. On the topic of, hey, are you okay? Are you okay? The first thing which comes to mind, obviously, is asking another person, are they okay, is about me and not about them. And then we can actually find this sort of dynamic, not just in this scenario, but like I would argue in like 90% of human conversations, there is some type of me asking for something while being socially nice, sort of, right? And it's almost as if there's this inverse between what is being said and how it's being said or to whom it's being said, the dynamic which is happening in the conversation versus what is being spoken out loud. When someone is very much eager to offer their help, they are getting as much out of it, if not more, than you are. Because they get, you know, they're being useful to someone, there is a dependency created, etc. Which brings the question, well, shit, is there, you know, true love, compassion, what have you, if every time I see compassion in the world, I'm just seeing selfishness, Like, what's going on here? And one of the answers to this is view on love and compassion as that which is able to subtract from or exceed this sort of implicit exchange, which is always happening between you and me when I ask you for something or when I give you something. This sort of power dynamic which is happening, this mutual dependence, right? And so one way of looking at love is letting go of needing the other person to be X, to behave like X, and so forth. Another way to look at it is forgiveness. No matter what they do to you, you're able to exceed the logical conclusion of the contract which was happening there, right? And so this idea of compassion and love as something which can transcend this mechanism is interesting. But so this means I don't like this definition of love and forgiveness. I think it sucks. I always want positive, good love, and just I'm fully unhappy with like saying love is letting go or love is forgiving, because it implies negative shit needs to happen for me to be able to love. Cannot I just fucking love? Like it, you know, it's so sad that I need to be able to forgive and to let go in order to love. Like, let's just love for the sake of loving. Yeah.
That's outstanding. I think you're, and actually it's wonderful, Mr. Jock and Text, because it makes me think about beauty and how we're just lost in the other. But I'll pass. I think that's a wonderful comment. I'm now thinking about negative pragmatism that Javier has been working on actually kind of negative contract, where there's a way where we're trying to avoid contract thinking. Like, I did this, exchange language, kind of logic of exchange and different things like that. And it's very interesting because what you're saying right there, I definitely think there's a problem of overly defining like love in the I let go, I don't hold against you, because then actually what that ends up happening is that can unintentionally create perverse incentives where there needs to be drama in relationships for it to feel real. Oh, if there's no fighting, then there's not real love. So we need to create conflict, and then there will be real love, right? Like that can subconsciously slip in, right? Where without negativity, there isn't reality. It makes me think a bit. I've always like and I've mentioned it before, the self-forgetfulness notion of Keller, which is everyone knows that selfish is bad, right? Like being selfish is bad. But actually being selfless can be bad because you're always talking how terrible you are and you're always like laying as a doormat, and that's no good. So he says you actually need self-forgetfulness, where you just don't think about yourself. You use it like a thumb, right? Like you don't think about your thumb. You don't cut it off, nor do you stare at it all day. You just use it, right? So likewise, yourself is supposed to be something you forget about. It would seem as if love has something to do with beauty, and the ability to just love makes me think of this idea that Studebaker, where the good in the classical is beyond presupposition. It just is the beautiful. And so you are just in the presence of the beautiful, and that love is that experience. That the moment you try to define it or say what it is, there's a way in which you're reducing the experience into terminology that then by definition makes it too one-sided, right? But then that would require for people to know how to condition themselves to experience beauty or to experience love without needing to define it. Like Jochen and I were talking about the difference between definition and the definitive. Like the definition of woman is not the same as the definitive object of Michelle, right? Like Michelle is one of one and you have to experience Michelle, which is a movement from definition to definitive. But that means you have to be able to stay in the actual, the concrete, and then to handle the negativity of particularity and the difficulty of one-on-oneness, because then we can kind of run to, yeah, it's Michelle, not Rashi, right? Run to definitions to escape. So there's something about, if we're not able to stay in the concrete per se, or the actual or the particular, we're always going to be in one-sidedness, which makes me think about politics following Hegel and the philosophy of right, starting on May 18th, the philosophy portal, the need for the radical concreteness to avoid just flipping one-sidedness. But let me pass it to Jochen and then Javier Rivera. Mr. Jochen, it is good to see you, sir.
Good to see everybody. Nice shout out. Good work. Good work on that hustle, Daniel. Never let the hustle end. Never ends. Yeah, Yuri, great to see you. It's my first time seeing you on the net, and I really appreciate your comment, right? Because I think in particular that whole it's funny in art school, one of the first things you learn is most critiques are actually about the person giving the critique, not about the work itself. So what happens when you give a critique, a lot of times what you're getting back from information about it is the resonance of the individual about the work, not about the work itself necessarily. Good critique generally tries to draw that out, do things, there's different methodologies to try to draw the work around that fact. But that's, like I said, in most people's naive opinion, that the critique, especially even if it's positive, by the way, actually both positive or negative, any more of it, it's somehow about the work. That's not necessarily true. And in fact, the better position most times is to assume that's a resonance of that subject responding to the work. That's what the critique's about. I only say that because a lot of discussions of "Are you okay?" it's exactly what Yuri is saying. I think it's basically like, I don't feel safe. I'm recognizing something is discordant. I need to verify what I'm sensing, so I'm safe. I mean, I'm being honest here. Like, that's in its most extreme form. That's the way you would interpret that. Generally, there's a sense of uneasy. The minimum level is just there's an uneasiness that the person's perceiving, in that act of "Are you okay?" is an act of, as I said, it's a self-referential act of communication about their perception of a situation, as opposed to care for that other in of itself necessarily. Like, that's just a basic level. There might be more to it, just like a good critique goes beyond the self-referential to be about the work. But usually it's because you'll normally start the critique with that point. When I see this work, my first reaction is, now I'm thinking through why am I feeling this way? Based on what you're telling me, what your intention is. You may summarize the intention of the work. And then you have this kind of this relationship happening of intention of the maker, of the designer or the artist, and the reception response by the viewer. And then the critique process is parsing through those two operations. Similarly, what Yuri's pointing out is that "Are you okay?" statement is, if it's transparently pointed out, he would say, "I'm noticing certain behaviors or certain things. You're being very quiet, or you're not responding in a way you normally do. This seems unusual to me." So you're just being upfront. You're being transparent about what it is this is about. It's about you're checking in because you're noticing something. But it doesn't have to stay there. You can go. Something seems wrong, and I care about you, and you're someone important to me. So I just want to check in and see how you're doing. You can't skip the step by dropping the first part, by saying, "Oh, this is about you." No, it's not. Like, it's not initially. It's both parts. If you're having a full transparent point, just a critique with artists, it's the whole idea of, like, a lot of times in art school and training, there's opinions people outside who think it's just pure subjective preferences and just whatever. There is no grounds for any discussion. I don't think that's true at all. The fact that we can even have these discussions and rationalize and have these kind of discourses about it just points that it's more complicated than anyone thinks. It's not just a subjective interpersonal experience. At the minimum, it's intersubjective, meaning there's multiple intersubjectivities going on. I don't even agree with that. I think it goes much deeper. It's basically interpenetrative, which is what Daniel talks about love and beauty, right? Those things have that power when really an encounter of the beautiful occurs, it's penetrative. It strikes through subjectivity and basically causes radical change. But that's why I think Yuri's comments, I think, are very good, though, to point out. And actually, the thing I want to last close is on, Javi's been kind of going on this negative pragmatism. I have to ask, actually, I'll put him on the spot now, so you can reply to me about this. Why exactly the name negative pragmatism? And I only bring this up because I've been chewing on this for weeks now, partly because of Daniel. I'm reading Daniel's Belonging Again, Part 2. Great book. I recommend it. Get it on Amazon. He's using a lot of Lacanian RSI, basically the real subjective imaginary, to make a very strong argument, probably the strongest I've ever seen Daniel make, on the nature of the subject. And actually, Goodell is here, and he's mentioned all over the place in chapter 3. So those interactions of those two, systems and subjects. I'm bringing this up because, tangent note, I'm reading Daniel's book, thinking about this idea of what is a thing. I say that because in Greek, pragma is used by Aristotle to identify thing, which is really fascinating. When we see pragmatism, that comes from Peirce, for example, and it's totally meant in a completely different way. That's meant in a mode of whatever works, basically. Like, we're going to just do whatever the fuck works to get the job done. Doesn't matter the reality of the propositions, claims, or models. Who gives a shit? As long as it gets us the outcome we want, that's what matters. I'm doing a very gross, simplified form of pragmatism in piercing modes, but whatever. I think it's fine. But that term pragma, I got curious. I haven't gotten the answer yet why he chose that name, because pragma from Aristotle means thing, and is used a lot in discussions of scientific investigations. This is the thing of investigation. It's the pragma, the thing of concern. And it gets really interesting because the meaning is going to get very subtle, because sometimes it means like objective thing outside, right? Or sometimes it means it's the thing of concern. That's very subjective in preference. That's a preference to a subject, making a demarcation of a thing to be concerned. I'm only drawing this out, this tension point about that term pragma, because some of this discussion about negative pragmatism, right, in the sense of like awareness of things only by negative interactions, states of privation, states of lack, states of loss. It's only in those moments of strike of loss or lack or privation that we become aware of it. I mean, that's my word about why you're choosing that name. But Javi, I'll give you the chance to kind of give that clarification. But just kind of circling through, I think that's kind of the tension point, right? What Yuri's pointing out, it's like, do we need to encounter moments of loss, lack, and privation to recognize reality? I kind of say, yeah, I think we do. In some operation, because even if it doesn't have to necessarily be painful per se, but that's probably what happens a lot necessarily. But I'm just thinking, I think just in the basic question of striking the subjective bubble of there's an outside reality that we have to encounter and relate with. It seems to be that it would seem to give that answer. It's like you kind of do, but I'll leave it at that.
Outstanding, and I'll give it to Javier and Philip. And I think that question, one, thank you for reading Belonging again, and that's very kind of you. And Systems and Subjects is outstanding, and I really enjoyed that book. And then yes, it's wonderful Cadell is here, and I think it's interesting because there is a question like, without that negativity, can you ever be free? You know, if there's no split between you and the world, can you have freedom? In a funny way, it'd be like, well, actually, if there's no split, you have ultra freedom. Actually, you just don't have the ability to know you're not free, maybe. Like the Kierkegaardian total depravity, where you don't even know you're in depravity. Like, if without negativity, there's a way in which you're not free, but you also haven't had the experience to know that you're not free, which thinks of the kind of thoughtlessness that, you know, that Hannah Arendt banality of evil. It's like, if you're thoughtless and you're robotic and mechanical in your everydayness, you don't even know that you're mechanical with your everydayness, right? And so you need that kind of freedom for the negativity. And, you know, that can kind of bring those things out. And it is funny to wonder if one can have freedom, but I'll pause there and pass it to Rivera. So Rivera, why'd you go with negative pragmatism?
Oh man, this is like the $1 million question. I mean, mainly because I was concerned about this idea of utility, optimization, efficiency, kind of like all the keywords that like a pragmatist would use, right? Like you have to do what's realistic. And what's realistic? Well, if you're trying to be realistic, generally people are going to say, and I think this is kind of like my general conception of like a phenomenological generality that I'm, you know, kind of interpreting from culture, is that the pragmatic position would be like, if you're going to be pragmatic, you got to be realistic. And if you're going to be realistic, you got to do what's efficient. And like, those are kind of just like all the key words that kind of just get lumped together. And so in some sense, my position on why I chose negative pragmatism is kind of phenomenological in a sense, or just maybe not even that's the word, but just kind of like my analysis on culture about this idea of everyone's trying to optimize, everyone's trying to go for efficiency, usefulness, utility, etc. Then, Joaquin, to answer your question, I was thinking, okay, how can we be pragmatic about useless things, or perceived useless things? And that's really, I mean, there's nothing much deeper than it's not much deeper than that, really. But to actually talk about what Jury brought up, the reason why I speculated that, and I just put this now, so Ebert would be hearing this for the first time. The reason why I started speculating that maybe you can't even start off with a negative pragmatism, or that's impossible, is precisely because it's like saying what Yuri said about like, well, why can't we just love for the sake of love? And I think the phenomenological position is that you need to first experience failure before you even get to that point. You know, you need to like, one, there's the brutality of difference. So it would be like if you have a partner, maybe I believe love is for the sake of love, but my partner goes, no, real love is about forgiveness, and I want forgiveness, right? So then it'll be like, so now what do you do? Right? What do you do in this brutality of difference? Your partner believes in a sort of exchange of forgiveness, or let's say your partner believes like in actual exchange, which like you do stuff, he does stuff, blah blah blah. But then you're like, oh, love is just for the sake of love. It's like now you're at an impasse because your partner wants something and you only want love for the sake of love. Now we're at this point of contention and failure. And I actually totally like the definition of love for the sake of love, because it totally, you know, leaves it open to this kind of like we're not utilizing it. It's just, you know, kind of useless in this sense. But it's at the point of failure between this brutality of difference where you don't even know what to do with this difference anymore. Right? What do I do? My perception of love is for the sake of it, and then my partner's perception is you know, this idea of forgiveness is what constitutes it, right? So basically once you've run out all of the options, now what do you do? Right? What do you do? And that's the pragmatic temptation of what do you do in this? But my answer to this is you keep encountering it. You don't try to, you don't say, oh, okay, maybe this isn't the thing that's going to work for us. I would say maybe one qualification is that as long as you have the desire to make it work, then maybe we can keep doing this. But how do you maintain the desire knowing full well that you have no plans or goals to even mitigate this impasse? And my answer to this in a negative pragmatic position is keep showing up. Keep showing up for the encounter, the possibility of the encounter. And maybe the partner discovers that love is just for the sake of love, or maybe you discover that actually you can't start off imposing the ideal of love is for the sake of love, and you actually have to do kind of a participation in forgiveness. Like, you don't know, because the encounter is going to just fuck that up, you know? Like, it's going to, like, what you're going to discover in that encounter is going to be interesting. And I think that's where concrete reality is going to be encountered, is in that impasse where you don't know what to do. You don't have any answers for the impasse. And yet my position is you keep fucking showing up. Like, you just keep going with the repetition, whatever the fuck that looks like. And then you just leave open for the counter. Now, I don't think it's perfect. I don't think my option's perfect, but yeah, here I am just constantly encountering my own position of just like throwing this word out there, seeing what happens. But yeah.
Well, thank you, Javier. I'll pass it to Philip and then Steve. And Guy and Alex, it is good to see you. I hope you're doing well. Well, it's very interesting because, like, on that example, like, I know Mr. Ebert has talked about hitting limit, encounter, limitless. We had that conversation. And then there's also the encounter. Like, you only really can be surprised in encounter. You really only can encounter limit, because otherwise you're thinking the limit is not really a limit, right? So there's something about the primacy of encounter. And then, so then there's the question, when you have the encounter of someone who defines, I just want love as love, and they say, I want love as forgiveness, there's a kind of Nash equilibrium. There's an impasse, a rational impasse, where rationality can't give you by, because someone has to sacrifice, and then love turns into a tally sheet. Okay, I sacrificed last Friday, and you should sacrifice on Tuesday, and we're in a power dynamic, right? And that doesn't seem to go very well. It doesn't go very well. In case anyone's wondering, don't do the tally sheet. Doesn't go very well. So but interesting, this could be like, you know, Mr. Ebert has said philosophy is about problematizing, right? What if in that situation, though, people had philosophy to say, wait a minute, what do I mean when I say love should just be love? And the person goes, wait a minute, should love just be forgiveness? Notice how that introduces a problematization or non-rationality, to use my language, of which makes the possibility of the suspension of that rational impasse, right? Where then in that situation, philosophy as the, let me ask about this, functions as a kind of grace, right? Of the possibility of working through, or otherwise you're stuck in power. So maybe there's something where the role of philosophy is to be there in the encounter when a rational impasse occurs, to allow the possibility of individuals by their own agency arriving at openness to the other outside of a power exchange logic, which otherwise you just end up with a tally sheet and you can never buy enough closeout ice cream to make up for that tally sheet. You know, you can go to the store. They sometimes have some really good ones on closeout, but otherwise it's $8 and you go bankrupt first. So, but actually we found some good ones. You'd be amazed, but let me pass it to Philip and then Steve. Philip, please.
That's when you go into debt, man. You just when in doubt, be like the US government. I think like I mean, isn't Hegel right there, right? Are we not orbiting around reconciliation? On some level, I think about John Gottman is like a marriage counselor guy, writes like 7 steps to fixing your marriage. And one of the things he talks about that reminds me of this conversation is that like I think he says there's 30% within the partner's powers to change, and then there's 70% that's not going to change. How do you decide that? And then I think like what Joachim was saying, then you bring in like the RSI, right? And it's like, okay, maybe the pain we have to feel is similar to like tying your shoes. It's like, all right, it's time for you to learn how to retie your Borromean knot. And like you're sitting there and the person is like, oh, that's in the part of the 70% of me that can't change. And you're like, oh, okay, so that thing is fixed. But like what you get at the Chinese restaurant can change. All right. And then I think it becomes about like irreconcilable differences and just being like, do I show up to an encounter continuously when certain, you know, some like opportunities for change, exits off the freeway, if you will, have just been passed. And then I think it's like, well, we're sort of at this point as a species where there's nowhere else left to go. You can't just be like, well, I'm out. Like, so it's learning on some level. Like, can you just leave the other person alone? Can you kind of like let them be? And maybe like there isn't much, maybe that's the greatest good. You know, where you get to this point where it's like, hey, we're going to have a million different definitions for love. And one of them is going to be keeping like a respectful distance and being like, every time we get together, we're probably just going to be cats and dogs. So let's like lean on the customs. Let's lean on the mores. I wonder how much of that is like people sort of triggering each other without even maybe knowing it. Like it's people dealing with their insufficiencies and then finding some kind of like perfect solution that'll get them wholeness and then failing and being like, gosh, it must be you. Instead of being like, ooh, that might just be like a structure of our condition. And how do you like, you know, kind of choose which battles are worth waging? Like if you're in a long-term relationship, it's different than, you know, someone you're living in an apartment with, you know, and there's like certain ways. I even think in a way like this is something Capital does actually kind of well, is like there's certain ways that you can just be like, hey, I'm staying my lane, you stay in yours, like peace be the journey. You know, you don't really have to like get together with them because you can pay for your own stuff and they do their thing and it's like it's all right.
No, that's a wonderful comment. I'll pass it to Steve and Eunoia. I mean, what you're saying right there is if we want to talk about escaping reductionism or the fullness of difference and pluralism, then we need to be able to handle difference. And difference is hard if it's real and it's in the encounter versus simply the idea of what constitutes difference, which tends to always fall in line with our ideology, right? So there's a challenge where in order to deal with, say, nihilism or some of these different melancholias, we have to be the kind of subjects of whom can handle difference. And this is where philosophy may be very important, Because I think about David Foster Wallace in that speech, that famous speech, this is water. And he makes that point where he says, when you see the guy cut you off in traffic and you're really angry at him, what if he's racing to the hospital to be with his dying wife, right? What about if that guy in line who's mean to you is like going home to a kid who's like really sick and they're not making any bills? And what he's saying is, I'm not saying that's the case, but the fact that it might be the case can have an effect of you not being so angry. And this makes me think of what Michelle has said on the idea that philosophy is good in creating uncertainty. Because uncertainty then frees you from the anger or the emotion. You get angry at the person, but then you go, wait, I actually don't know their story. And then that calms you down. Or when the news is telling you we're all going to die, and you say, well, I don't know that. You can be free from the speed of a pulverillium or different things, right? And that could also...
Isn't that exactly like a real-time quick shift of the symptom? Like something real happens.
Yes.
You have a story of what's going on. You have what you imagine, and you're like, maybe I should. And if someone is just like, Nietzsche sometimes will just be like, he says all this stuff and they blink, meaning like just no awareness that that's even possible. It's just like, no, this is like everything I see must be because of this. And, I don't know, just to problematize.
No, it's exactly right. Like, David Hume's going to say philosophy outside of the common life, which is basically the realm of the encounter and the experience, doesn't know when its timing is adequate or when its timing is actually avoiding the other person. So you always have to bind the philosophical act to the immediacy and the encounter. But then the next philosophical move is, but what if you're just saying that so you don't actually have to confront their negativity and you're trying to tell a story to where you're justifying how they're acting and you're avoiding them, right? The choice. You always have to come to the choice, right? Philosophy cannot do your choosing for you, right? So there's always a certain fear that has to be faced. And that's why at the beginning, this question of the difference between anxiety and fear is really, really big. It's like philosophy, it's almost like what philosophy can do is provide uncertainty to pull you out of the determinations of the immediacy of the experience so that a clearing opens up for a choice that you might be wrong about. And yet you have to make a choice all the same. And that's the act of freedom, precisely because you could be wrong. And yet without that, this is what seems interesting. Without that ability to create uncertainty, to stop the determination, the flow of emotions, all of that, create the clearing and choose, without that ability, it doesn't seem like you can have freedom or something like agency. I know is a word that Henriquez and them has been stressing more so, like agency versus free will, on this idea. Without that, can you have love in relationships? Because that seems to be what you get into a lot of trouble, right? Like if both parties don't have that capacity to stop, clear, choose, and then the love is the act of the commitment to continually choosing the other, right? Like I trust you. You said you love me, so I'm going to trust that in that clearing you will choose me. Oh, but you're not going to choose me in a manner that isn't for my good. Oh, well, I don't. Oh, wait, what? That means I might have to change, and I'm going to not think I need to change because otherwise I would have already changed. So I have to trust their judgment. But what if they're acting out of their own insecurity and they're trying to control me? The absolute choice yet again, right? Right? And that means you have to always be willing to participate in that very messy artistic process. And this is where things like maybe the language of optimization, what's practical, all of these things can help you get to this point, but they can't go beyond this point, maybe, where then it's just the radical absolute choice kind of comes to mind. But let me pass it to Steve and Yuri. Steve, it is wonderful to see you today, sir. It is always a pleasure. I hope you're doing well.
I am doing well, and thank you for August company. It's very wonderful to be here. All this discussion, especially this provocation of negative pragmatism, it's very, very interesting to me because it's one of the things I've been exploring a lot recently is this idea of this myth of separation, or an idea of separation. You might also want to, from a worldview perspective, you might say kinship model, kinship worldview, right? What would reality look like if we actually chose to reframe our context from a perspective of kinship and recognizing we're not separated? Then many of these questions around these analytical questions, or these questions of me versus somebody else, or my will and somebody else's will, agency versus power, becomes sitting in a soup of recognition of sameness and love. That's sort of, sameness, you could say, or love is in a lot of ways can be synonymous with it. This idea of negative pragmatism now is really proactive, because there's nothing pragmatic about a kinship worldview. There's nothing pragmatic about it. It's really basically being submissive or surrendering to the whole, and then not in some socialist / communist / anarchist model, but more a model of I am you, you are me, and ultimately, we do reach some post-apocalyptic scenario. These kinds of this worldview is going to be highly valued, very highly valued, very necessary. And so maybe all I just wanted to offer was this idea that maybe thinking occasionally from the perspective of where am I from an agency perspective, but where are we all, and are we all in this together in some sense? And then embodying that, having a true phenomenology of what is it, what's the direct physical experience, what's the direct experience of that, allows these questions of the one-to-one, or did you take my space, did I take yours, am I going to get the cheapest ice cream, am I going to get the quality ice cream? All of a sudden we're in a scenario where maybe things work a little more smoothly and less stress and pressure is there, and maybe happiness somewhere along the line shows up. I don't know. It's something that's been very interesting for me as I've played with, to think through it from that perspective. So I offer that. And just one other thing, I think, Thomas, you said something talking about critique from an art perspective. I was recently reading a book by a guy named Robert Moss, who does stuff with dream work, right? And one of his things that they do when they do dreams, when they're talking about each other's dreams, they say, if this were my dream, if someone will say something about a dream and you're getting somebody else's perspective on it, it was like, if this were my dream, this is how I might interpret it, or this is how I might experience it. And I think from an artistic perspective, it's like, if this were my painting, or this were my piece of work, or this was my piece of work, but the critique is typically, no, let me say what's wrong, rather than let me say from my perspective. So I don't know if that offers anything to what you were bringing there from a critique perspective, but anyway, I just thought I'd put that out there. So
that is very interesting. And Michelle knows I'm always getting the cheap ice cream, not the quality ice cream. And we just hope that the cheap ice cream is quality. Second, I'm very taken by the idea of what would that dream mean if I were to have it. I don't remember the last time I had a dream, like ever. Michelle has the most like epic dreams ever. And I'm now very curious next time she tells me a dream, and I'm going to like imagine what that means about me. That's very interesting. And actually that, it makes me think, just as to know what you're saying, in the paper, Critical Thinking, very often the problem is when people, we say all the time, put your feet in another person's shoes. But actually what we do is put our shoes in another person's shoes. We very rarely put our feet in another person's shoes. And that requires an act of critical thinking. Is not merely criticism, but it actually is an ability to kind of critique from a position that has skin in the game, the unfolding of that thing from more of not just merely feeling, but structurally, but entering it, also assuming, well, this is like when we did short stories, it's extremely important that the person who's critiquing the short story assume that there's a reason for everything done. Like, you may not like the fact that the character went to X versus Y location, but rather than saying, hey, this is stupid, you say, why did you go to X versus Y? And give charity. Like, there's got to be a kind of charity in critique. And charity is not passivity, though. It's openness to receiving the reason of the other person. And I think there's something about that when we're talking about the harmony with the other person. Like, one, if in a relationship, you are assuming they're in it for my good. Okay, well, that's a really nice common basis to have, right? Because if you cannot assume that, then there might be some issues that are emerging, right? But if you can assume, okay, you're in it, we're in this for each other's good, and yet we have reached a disagreement. Okay, this, or problem, or conflict. Okay, this conflict cannot be a result. It makes me think of that really good book, Being Wrong, by Kathy Schultz, I think is what it's called. And she says the problem is if you get someone who you think is wrong, you tend to say they're either stupid, dumb, like they're stupid, they're misinformed, they don't have the information, or they're evil, right? Like it's got to be one of those three. They're stupid, misinformed, or evil. Very often in relationships, we start off saying, oh, they just don't have the information. Let me give it to them. Let me tell them what they need to do. Oh, crap. Now you're controlling them, right? And if they don't like your control, then we go, well, they must be stupid. They must just be dumb. And then once they do that, it's like, oh, no, they're not dumb. They're evil. Oh, crap. So you kind of fall down this ladder, right? Well, philosophy could help you go, no, it's actually possible for people to have ideas of the good and to intend the good, but because we as humans in our subjectivity and finitude don't know everything, it's possible for out of goodness to arrive at a mistake that's actually maybe not a mistake, but an imperfection that's inherent with a world that is finite and developing and we don't know all the information. So you remove the certainty to be open to that process. And to me, like ideas of harmony, like working with the whole, like the whole for me, like we've talked about, is not like a blob, but creating the whole is like, I'm the violin, you're the pianist, we're different, but we're going to relate, not trying to become one another. But I know that the pianist is there for the violinist. I'm a violinist and different, but she knows I'm there for the pianist, and yet we've hit a dissonance. I'm not going to say it's because they don't know music or they're stupid. I'm not going to have those assumptions or self-sabotage. What I'm going, oh, I need to get closer to the piano because they can't hear me. Oh, okay. So I am trying to work with the conditionality to arrive at an effect that actually is also greater than us, because the music of Beethoven's Ninth is greater than us, right? But now this is where we're talking about some kind of beauty that's there beyond who's the best musician, right? I'm not trying to be better than the other person. I'm thinking of something beyond. But definitely, like, I definitely think one of the great things, and then I'll give it to Yuri, Javier, and then Mr. Jockin, and Mr. Luber, good to see you, sir, is that philosophy can actually help you not fall into the mistake of interpreting wrongness or disagreement as evidence of either stupidity, misinformation, or evil. Like, it can actually help you realize, you know what it, and this is what Kathy Solt says. She says, you know what it feels like to be wrong? You know what it feels like to be wrong? Being right. That's the problem. When you're wrong, you feel like you're right. Well, this is an issue. So what do we do? Well, the only answer is to question the feeling of being right. Why would you do that, though? You feel right. Why would you question feeling right? And that, to me, is like that's freedom. The ability to question the feeling of being right, not the question of being wrong. We think freedom is found in moving the wrong to the right. Actually, freedom is found in the ability to question the feeling of being right, to realize, oh, I need to negate, sublate that. And so there's something about pragmatism, and if I were to use Javier's language, when I think of negative pragmatism, most pragmatism is a movement from the wrong to the right. How to be more right? How to be more productive. When really, freedom in the fullness of the subject is found in the capacity to question yourself even when you're right, even when you think you're productive, even when you think you're utilitarian, and to do that in an artful way, not an anxious way. Because the temptation would be to fall into a paralyzing anxiety, but you learn the art of questioning when you feel right, so that you still have conviction and choice, but you don't fall into a determination that's just going with the feeling of being right that then leads to all sorts of conflicts. But let me pass it to Yuri, Javier, and Mr. Jockin. Yuri.
Oh my, there's so much there. I have a bunch of notes, so I'll just go from the beginning. To Philip's point on structural versus what is structural versus what is flexible, that's something which I face all the time, which is like, you learn something about yourself, and now can I change this, or is this a part of who I am? I don't know. And to give you an example, I was talking to a girl, and then she started talking about herself and something which triggered me and I didn't like. I'm like, oh, I don't like her. Next moment, she started talking about some guy. I was like, oh, I like her. I can win her over. And just like this, 10-second interval, I felt the literal pendulum of my entire phenomenology. Everything which I feel is true and right and beautiful inside of me is so dependent on just this simple logical movement, and just so logically, structurally conditioned is my entire freaking phenomenology. Like, how absurd is this? Okay, so yeah, that's one thing which I wanted to say. Then if we go from there. And Daniel mentioned this idea of a clearing. And the funny thing is, I think clearings tend to happen after the thing is over, after you fucked up already. Like that's the most likely place where a clearing will happen. So like when you're in that relationship and you really want it, and you won't get a clearing. It just won't happen. It's almost like you're bound to not get that clearing until you fuck up and it's over, and then you can learn. So there's just, and I feel like there's something so structural about this, something, and yet we must still strive to make those clearings when we are in the weeds, when we are in the mud, and we have to, you know, fight to make it work and whatnot. So it's really sort of like an, you know, maintaining relationships with people is just an absurd fight against the nature of retroactive knowledge. It's just so strange. Yeah, and then going back to phenomenology, I think that clearing is something of a pre-verbal thing, as in you manage to create some space outside of logical structures or bound by language, or social structures which are bound by language. I do this, you do this, we did this to each other, which is just like this very mechanical thing. And this clearing sort of gives some space away from this mechanical phenomenology, language bound phenomenology, which we are so used to. And so here I think there's some sort of dialectic between the pre-verbal and the verbal, maybe what Daniel would call non-rational and rational, for example. So I think, and this is where, you know, in our philosophical spaces, we tend to critique the inadequacy of meditation to solve all problems. You know, of those hippies who want to solve everything with love, and we're like, no, we have to think about this. And creating these clearings is exactly the right place where meditation and those sort of pre-verbal techniques, such as psychedelics and what have you, are to be used, like to create this clearing, and maybe, you know, run ahead of yourself before you fuck something up and you need to fix it, but maybe try to create that clearing before it's already over. So I'll stop there.
No, that's excellent. And I think just as a quick note, now I'm thinking, is negative pragmatism the practical response to the screw up? Like after everything blows up, like how should you respond? Because most of the time, most advice is how to avoid screw up, how to avoid mistaking different things. It's like, no, what is the proper way to respond to the screw up without it just falling back into the maybe power dynamics that led to it? Because that's actually a big problem. Like very often people respond to a crisis with a solution that just keeps in place the meta structure that arose to the crisis in the first place, right? Because it is interesting, like, it seems like screw up is inevitable in life. The question is simply how one will respond to it. And you can go through your entire life never getting that, never getting that idea, right? Because often screw up is interpreted of how do I make sure I don't screw up again, versus how do I change the horizon according to which I live, of which is now aware that my ideas of what are good can come in conflict of what's actually good and the real. What does this mean? That I am capable of surprising myself? What does this mean? That the things that motivate me and my best intentions can lead to a place that actually are in conflict with isness? And how do I actually see that as an invitation to something better or good or higher? Because now I know of the possibility of, say, beauty, good, and trueness. And just as a last point as well, and then I'll give it to Javier, Mr. Jochen, and Guy, is the notion of, yes, what's that, Yuri?
Just a quick point. So this thing you just said is exactly the negotiation between the verbal and the nonverbal, or the rational and the non-rational, right?
Yes.
Like, and we are supposed to learn to negotiate from both places, because
Yes.
each part of our phenomenology will encounter the otherness of the opposite phenomenology, right?
Yes.
So our non-rationality will encounter the rationality of the
Yep.
world, and our rationality will encounter the non-rationality of the world, and we need to be able to negotiate from both places.
100%. And the amount of times that occurs is greatly enhanced and multiplied by the presence of pluralism and diversity. And so for most of history, you could kind of get away with not being very good at that. But the more you're in an interconnected world, the more and more you need to be good at that. And we're not good at that. So we're retreating to various forms of atomization. I mean, on the meditation point as well, like you've seen American Pentecostalism, because, you know, there's this idea of, oh, a lot of the Christianity is very stiff, not really alive. We need to be more kind of active. But they went on the side of emotion and activity without, say, any thinking. And then it went into chaos land. But then if you're on the side of no life at all, it's just stagnant and nobody's joining the church, right? So likewise, you can have a world where you never engage in meditation, you're never reflective, and so you're always caught in the busyness of things. But then you can also do that as a way to escape actually being involved in the world. But then you can have a thing where you're involved in the world and you're always practical and you're never wasting time meditating. And so you're actually captured by the system of control or different things. The human incredibly struggles with any bothness. It is not natural to think bothness, because I hate to think that I can't do everything I need to do all at once, because that means I'm not all powerful. There's an inherent humility that comes from the acknowledgement of needing many. If I need to do many things, how do I even order it? What do I decide to do first, and when, and for how long? And all these decisions arise. And how do I even begin making these decisions? What do I even do? I'd like to believe there's just one road I need to take, let alone think there are many roads I need to take in different ways, and other people may take the roads in different ways. And nobody actually likes difference, because the moment we encounter difference, we ask about ourselves and our choices, and that's very difficult to not respond to in terms of anxiety. But let me give it to Javier Rivera. Mr. Rivera.
Yeah, I guess I'll address Philip's. I was sharing this idea in IDW, and I mean, basically, like, yeah, it's very Hegelian. Negative pragmatism is already very Hegelian. So in some sense, it's not really anything like phenomenologically new or phenomenal, you know, not anything crazy, but I do think it's very helpful. I mean, it's it's definitely a very helpful term. From what, I was having my conversation with IDW with, and Alex Ebert was one of them, and so was Bard. So I really like what Steve said too. This idea of that, negative pragmatism would actually be more active, because actually the tendency would be two options, right? When you come across a specific situation, you either revert to, okay, we're just going to try to go through all the options that we think might work. And then there's the other part where it's like, well, fuck it, we're screwed anyways, right? Let's just let it burn and fall. I'm really having a hard time thinking about how would we know to leave alone the temptation to exhaust all the possible options. Because I feel like you would have to exhaust all the possible options to get to the point of where negative pragmatism becomes possible. But then there's that other part where it's like, well, I'm just going to fucking do nothing, or I'm just going to give up. And then you can get yourself in this weird repetition where it's you exhaust all the possibilities, then give up. Or you find a possibility, never give up, and that's the possibility that hinges on your entire existential contingency ever, and then so on. So like that's like that weird repetition that kind of concerns me, because I'm thinking like, okay, if negative pragmatism is only possible within failure, then there's something funny about the way we're failing, because we seem to be repeating in a way where we kind of ironically avoid that failure. Does that make any sense? Like we're avoiding the failure in that repetition, either by giving up. So giving up would be, I'm not choosing to encounter this anymore, because there's no further possibility to even choose to encounter this situation anyways. But negative pragmatism would be saying you need to encounter it anyways, even though you have exhausted all the possibilities, even though you are tempted to give up. And so I guess I'm saying you just have fucking faith, trust. I mean, I don't know. I don't really know. I mean, I think there is something like that happening in what I'm saying. I don't think it's really like wow, but I do think, I mean, maybe it could help. But then I would be a little bit odd if someone goes, "Hey man, I'm practicing my negative pragmatism." Like I would be a little bit concerned if people were telling me, "Yeah, I got like negative practitioners or whatever." Because I feel like that would be kind of missing the point, because I feel like it's a very contingent, emergent situation that perhaps negative pragmatism becomes possible, but not something that you could actually practice, because practicing what? Like you haven't failed yet. So what would you be practicing? The only thing that could come away with the negative pragmatism is that you would understand the Lacanian notion is that there is a non-relation to everything. There is no ideal. No ideal is possible. Maybe that's the awareness that you could take in with the negative pragmatism. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm these are
So
my
like it's
questions.
impossible pragmatism. Huh? Negative pragmatism that's always like never possible and it's different. Isn't that the ultimate? No, it's very good. I think for me, just as a quick note, and then I'll pass it to Jochen and Guy Sengstock, is the kind of idea that basically the necessity of failing in a manner that also annihilates its capacity of then a certain optimization from that failure, kind of in a way requires pluralism and community in the other, of whom you encounter that is so different from you, you can't necessarily, like the encounter of the other is the perpetual restart of the failure. But the restart of that failure, if it's committed to perhaps the beautiful, or it's committed to something, can be a failure that is an opening. And whatever is then revealed in that opening can only ever happen in that opening. So it's gone from there, right? Like the failure, like every, Tolstoy has that famous line everyone knows where he says, every happy family is the same, but every sad family is different, right? Maybe there's something about every failure is a unique opening, perhaps if rightly conditioned to the beautiful, that can't be taken beyond that failure. But so all you can do is have the commitment of going back into the place of surprise, which the ultimate surprise is person, right? There's always a kind of unknown to them, right? Which every failure that is encountered is an opening of a possibility that can't be moved beyond that failure. Every failure is a one of one, per se. And as a one of one, it has to be held in memory as maybe a model of possibility, but it cannot become a determination by which you then can kind of plan every encounter, right? And then maybe the last thing I'll say, there's another thing like on the negative pragmatism. I think there's a wonderful book by John Mausick, and he talks about the problem with, say, basically he's talking from a Christian standpoint. There's a problem in telling people you're Christian, because then it becomes a kind of currency, like a social currency. Like he talks about Bonhoeffer, Gregory of Nicaea, Kierkegaard, on the idea that a Christian is someone who doesn't talk about being Christian, because the moment you do, it has a kind of social currency. But the problem is you're going to always encounter people, say if you go to church, who want you to confess your Christianity or align with something, right? How do you pragmatically avoid currentization? How do you pragmatically avoid turning something into a currency? You can turn philosophy into a currency. You can turn intellectualism you can turn everything into social currency. So maybe there's something about how is it that you live in a manner that avoids currentization and yet doesn't isolate, because that's usually what people do. You just say, well, I'll just avoid people because people suck. No, John, then you can't have the surprise and the opening and the failure and all that, right? And so there's something about the ability to learn the art of encountering and openness without temptations of currentization, of creating currencies that give you power or dominance or different things over others. That might be another part of the equation, but let me give it to Jochen and Guy Sengstock and then Alex Ebert. Thomas Jochen, please.
No, it's funny you bring that up, Daniel, because actually, I'll piggyback on that point you just said. Because Stephen, I think you made a great point. I really love that idea you brought up of if someone's sharing a dream, it's almost like wearing that dream, someone else's dream, like a piece of clothing, right? And then I just say that because I talk about this in my my lecture series on Plato and the Beautiful. There's this kind of penetrative personal experience in the aesthetic experience, right? You have to take on the thing you're reviewing and evaluating. It's very similar what Daniel was commenting on. When you look at an essay, any kind of mode of critique, does not matter what the object is. The positioning of it is not scientific in the sense of it's an object out there and you're just observing it from afar. It's much more an interpenetrative experience, and you start there. But there's actually something important here Daniel brought up too. You know, the idea is that even if you disagree, you're in your resonance with the object you're wearing, you have a tension with it, you know, basically withholding the judgment to obliterate the difference or the tension by saying, no, this is stupid or wrong. Maybe because Daniel's saying because there's an intention behind it. But they kind of draw that point out a little bit. You know, the best critiques, if all the members involved are in the right kind of state when they do it, there's probably going to be an acknowledgement that maybe sometimes the intentions are not totally, they're there, but not known. So what I mean by that is sometimes in the discourse of a work, right? Let's say you go through the proper protocol of you resonate with the work, you're dressing, you're putting on the work, and you're first approaching by speaking about your response to it. Then you're asking to investigate the intentions of the maker. Sometimes in the following discourse that occurs, there's like a feedback mechanism where something got revealed that wasn't intentionally there from the beginning, but was always there. But it was not known at the time until the discourse happened. That's happened plenty of times. That's happened in this group many times. Like a topic or idea, I put it out there, for example, and then the group kind of chews on it or responds to it. And then I walk away, I'm like, that's a really interesting point, what Daniel said or what Javier said or what Philip said about that. And I'll go away and I'll resonate on that point. That wasn't known before. And there's something comes afterwards from that experience. I'm just saying, because I just related to Daniel said, like, notice that's completely not that economic procedure because it can't scale. Like in that raw aesthetic experience, it's personalized. It has to be in that subjective person in that moment working with each other in the work. It can't scale because of that. So it almost kind of like goes, I don't know if that's too strong of a claim to make, it gets away the kind of commodity status stuff. I feel like it does because of the point of that kind of authenticity of not having positions or being willing to be moved, right? Because the idea, a lot of bad critiques is that people have staunch positions, almost acting like there's almost like scientific distance about it, where the creator had an intention, he's sticking to that. He ain't moving for nothing and for no one. And it becomes a thesis defense as opposed to an actual discourse and critique dialogue that is about revealing out what actually is the principle behind the work in the first place. It may be something that was always there but not aware of by the maker that in the discourse can show up. So I'm just resonating on that because I think that feeling, and like in dream space, in discussion about dreams, that's probably what happens too. And Stephen, I'll have to hear your thoughts about that because the whole point is that if a colleague puts on your dream and resonates to the symbology or the reference of it, by sharing that with the original person who had the dream, there might be something that got revealed that wasn't initially aware of. This is exactly, I feel like it's a very similar structure, like West the literature or even in this group again. So I find that I've been saying what I'm getting at here is almost kind of what Javier's pointed out. What do you do in the state of failure? Part of it is making the presumption that you know all the knowns. That's not true. And that's one of I think it's not one of the main disciplines of philosophy is to teach us that we cannot, that is not the case. There are unknowns that we have no idea are even in the equation at all. And our parents thinking that we've reached the conclusion, it may not be the case. But it takes almost that moment of failure to kind of open yourself up to even see that possibility. I just say that because I think there's plenty of cases where you have to keep going under a certain account until it fails. And then when you kind of sit there and I failed, I'm in the adrift abyss, you get a revelation of some kind, in some way, in some mode, either through you sitting with the lack or sitting with the failure, or in the discourse about it. It's almost like because it is not true. I don't know about anybody else. I know it's true for me. When I'm in my crisis or failures, my friends I go to my discourse becomes even more important. I seem to want to discourse more when there's failure. I don't want to discourse when things are going great. I want to discourse when things are going in failure. I don't know. That's kind of interesting, right? It's almost like we use discourse mechanisms to kind of talk through in the same way. And I think of my friends actually who, empathetic states. When we say an empathetic relationship with someone, is that not the same kind of idea? We're approaching that failure or lack, where instead of just looking at it from afar, either with tokenisms or abstract ideas, we put on that dress of the failure. How would I feel if I was in that experience? Wife dies, I lose my job. How would I resonate to this? What would be the tensions? I think that big part of this idea is like, what is the tensions? What is the conflicts? What are the limitations about this experience? Because that's also the big problem. Is it's very hard to give it any advisement or any kind of recognition about the situation. We don't have the constraints. That's true in art and design and just ethic and just life experience in general. So I'm chewing on this. I think there's something very interesting about this, because I just pause on this 1 second, because other conversations I had with you, Daniel, especially, we kind of made a similar comment of why love has to be personalized on exactly the same way, right? Because this act of love is interpenetrative, right? It's kind of and this requires a kind of personal, attentive definiteness, and that is in the exact opposite of abstraction. So just kind of hot take this, just kind of riffing on this point. Aesthetic experience, meditative, kind of empathetic experiences, meditative states, all require this kind of penetrative aesthetic experience that is by definition definite and aware of constraints and limitations, which is the exact opposite of abstraction. It's exactly the opposite. But yet, ironically, but in a bizarre, wacky world, you can reveal principles that are that were there but not known. They only reveal themselves in these openings. I don't know. I'm just riffing on that point. I think it's interesting.
Well, that's fascinating. As you were speaking, then I'll give it to Guy and Alex on the idea that in the same way that when you write a short story, for example, and you give it to the other person, there's something unique that happens when you hear them say what it meant to them, or maybe you write a play and they go on and talk about it, they review. And it's very interesting because there's a kind of revelation that can only happen when you take something that you create and the other person says it back to you or they respond to it, right? Actually, you learn things about the work that you didn't even know was there, and yet how is that even freaking possible? How can you put something in something that you didn't know was there, right? And then it also shows that the work lives beyond. It's funny because that dynamic is actually kind of what happens perpetually in conversation. I say something, give it to you, and then you say something back that I didn't even know I said, or maybe I didn't say what I thought I said, and there's this perpetual performance. It's almost like writing a play, and then everyone kind of performs the role, and you're like, wow, I didn't know that was what I was writing or what I was saying, right? And that comes back, and there's a special kind of resonance. But then, what does a bad artist do? No, that's not what the play says. No. That's not what it's about. No. You have to be able to annihilate that and let the work have a certain life beyond you, and you enjoy. It's almost like you have to enjoy the life of the thing beyond you that exceeds your scope of what you thought it was. And that's what good parents do with children, right? They say, oh, I thought that they let the children be their own person, but doesn't leave the children in a kind of chaotic guidance way. Right? Like the parents become elders to guide the children to become something that is not reducible to the expectations of the children. I mean, of the parents. Well, that's weird. There's a hierarchy there. There's an eldership, but also a humility. There's a negation of what you think is practical, but there's also guidance on what you think that if the kid asks, right? These are what I think are the realities of the human experience that are not captured in many of the terms like pragmatism or self-help or whatever, that are a much more fuller experience of the human subject. And then Yuri had good points, because there is this idea as well, like when Mauzik talks about currency, he's talking about where I tell you I'm like a Christian or I'm a CEO so that you get social standing. But at the same time, if someone asks you, oh, are you an artist? There's a temptation. No, I'm not an artist. I'm a nobody. When actually you should stand up and say, no, I am an artist, right? But this would actually be an example of being able to tell the difference of facing fear, like you're afraid to speak a category and just say what category you fall under. You're afraid to kind of speak a commitment, but in other times you're speaking a commitment to use it as currency and standing. And Yuri's also making an interesting point on there's something about status that's good, right? Like when you see a beautiful work of art, that's the status of that thing is beautiful. But then there's another form of status that is using to shield yourself from vulnerability. So maybe there's something where the problem is status outside the encounter. Maybe it's status outside of the work. Maybe that's also getting into like this difference, because you can make difference between, the problem is most people have ego, they don't have character, would be kind of the distinction. Like character results as a kind of status that comes from the encounters of the negativity and the handling of surprise and all of these different things. But all of those distinctions, of which are tricky in one conversation, may follow set A and another conversation set B and another conversation set C, all of that would suggest what you would have to be good at, and thus a different, dare I say, map of what is practical for those conversations that could shift, that you have to figure out as you move on. So you can't have a kind of, well, that would mean it's also bound to the relationality of that particular situation that you're in, and like creating a clearing for that, which seems to be very difficult and we're all going to fail at. But then there's, you know, there is a certain development that occurs in that. But anyway, let me pass it to Guy Sengstock and then Alexi. But Mr. Sengstock, it is good to see you, sir.
Good to see you too. Good to see everybody. I've been enjoying everybody here. These modal switches of like this way that the I and the thou and the I and the it are bound to each other, right? These different I's that kind of come up, like based on somehow the way we, I don't know, it's the way we apprehend, the way we see, the way we're struck, this something that we have something to do with, and then something in which we have nothing to do with, but isn't serendipitous, but yet isn't like what Thomas said, this way of the involvement of a, you know, you take something in as a work of art, right? You know, what's striking to me though is the question, like I keep feeling into as I'm listening to all of you, the through line that kind of showing up for me is this kind of question of like, how can I be more prone to this thing I can't do, I can't force, but I have everything to do with, but nothing to do with, this kind of sweet spot of, for lack of a better term, of I-thou-ness. It's something like like how do I be addressed by the hyphen between the I and thou, right? What is that way where I'm somehow vulnerable to being caught in by beauty? Like, what are these things that ways that we can appropriate ourselves in the world, like that is tuning into that, right? Like that's the thing I keep, it's like a gravity in this conversation. I keep going, huh. You know, and it's now just struck me, I had this really amazing conversation with my wife, many of these conversations with my wife, where she's talking about, like, and the thing I'm fascinated about is her experience of being a mother for the first time. We have a 2-year-old at home. And I had been gone to Florida. I hadn't been home for a while, and I come back, and it was our first time where we could kind of just settle in and just, you know, be there together. And she started talking about this, I think for her experience of being a mother, because she didn't ever want to be. She had no innate desire to be a mother. And so it was a little bit more of an intellectual decision that she decided out of nowhere once she started watching Jordan Peterson. I like it. So at 50, I have to decide, do I want to be a father again? Right. And then she has a child, and it is this, she is in this inexhaustive amazeness of being, this is the only thing she ever wanted to do. But it was nothing that she ever wanted before that. It's this whole, it's watching this kind of deep transformation going on with her. That is like the child being birthed and the mother being birthed are both at the same time. And it's just stunning to be in the presence of. And we were talking about her experience of him. And she's saying like, yeah, there's these moments where, and like everyone kind of knows this experience if you're ever around kids. Like there's these moments where the child has this, dude, they're just so fucking adorable. Like they're so like innocent and adorable that like literally it starts to hurt and like you just want to eat them. Right? Like there's this kind of, it's like this, it's like it's pleasurable, but like as it intensifies, like I think the desire just to eat them is in some levels to relieve the tension that's in that experience of cuteness or something like that. And then she brought this other thing up. She's like, but then there's the moments where he's beautiful. And that caught me. And I'm like, is that the same as cuteness? Is that different than the cuteness? Are they connected? And she thought about it. We had this long conversation about like, no, when he's beautiful, it's not reducible to any particular thing he's doing. there's just a moment where what gets caught sight of is this thing that empties you out, right? There's some kind of experience of like a self-emptying and an oh my godness of this, of beholding something that's like simultaneously irreducible and inexhaustible, yet absolutely definite, right? And concrete at the same time. This place where everything comes together. And we, as we talked about it, the place where we kind of realized was like, yeah, it's like when he's cute, it's really more bound into what he is, right? Or how he is in some way, right? There's some kind of element of what howness going on, right? Where that seems to be the focal setting that comes forward when he's cute. And then when he's beautiful is when it's more like that he is. This experience of thatness. That, and I think that, like, in my experience, it's that moment which are the quintessential moments of intimacy. Like when you're really like, you go through something with somebody and there's this kind of moment where it's like something greater than the sum of all of us comes, and there's this kind of moment of like, oh, you are this, and this kind of abandonment to that experience of beauty. And I think the question I have is, like, in some way, I feel like also what compels me to philosophize and to think at all at this level is something about trying to mine that, right? This, and that is a really strange thing to mine, because it's like, because on one level you ask, well, like, everything around you is, right? It's thatness is just kind of self-evident in some way. But yet, how do you know? Like, when you go to describe it, all you can do is describe what's and how's. But what is this obvious but ineffable? Do we actually perceive that? This thatness, right? In some way. And I have a feeling something about this attunement, this appropriation to this hyphen has something to do with how do we have any kind of say-so in addressing this thing that we're talking about.
When you mentioned Martin Buber, I saw Javier scream, so very well done, because that's his boy. Well done, guys, Sengstock. And now I'm really thinking about, like, Javier's book. Maybe you have a book title, Javier, The Hyphen of Buber, because that's very interesting. A lot of focus on the I and the thou, but not the hyphen. And there's some sort of focus on that hyphen. And then I'll give it to Alex and Javier. And yeah, what you're saying, there's something like when Mr. Ebert and I was speaking, there's some sort of encounter of a radical thatness that seems to be also a kind of limitation that is encountered, because it can't go beyond thatness. It's limiting you in the fullness of your grasping. And that, like Mr. Ebert and I were saying, I think is a kind of presupposition-less basis of philosophy, because it is based on an encounter, not a presupposition. And it's interesting because then it would suggest that there is something about philosophy that is, in order for it to have a presuppositionless ground, if you will, it requires a very concrete encounter. And the thought is then orbiting and can never replace this encounter. That brings with it a certain limit that then, funny enough, in encountering that limit, you're now talking about it. Right? The limitless, as Ebert said, creates limitlessness. You're then talking all the time about this limit you hit, right? You would think that once you hit this thatness, you cannot describe, you'd be done with it. You'd be like, well, that was that. But you never do that. You go, that was that. And then it just, boom, there's a certain explosion that occurs. But what's very interesting is that maybe that's one of the reasons why there seems to be this deep connection between speaking and philosophy in these kind of conversations, because that's when you encounter a that you didn't expect, an idea you didn't know you want to have because someone else said it. And I think that point of you found a want you didn't even know you wanted, that I think is huge. That capacity to be like, I definitely have found one of the most practical, useful things to do is to realize that I don't know what I should want, actually. Like, I actually don't know. I think I do. And that doesn't mean it's bad not to try to go get those things. But the ice cream flavor that I thought was good actually was not. And the ice cream flavor I wanted and didn't even know I wanted was actually the bourbon chocolate. That was the one, right? And that openness to the receiving of once you didn't know you wanted, of that's that are only that seems to be the kind of business that philosophy really needs to be in the business of. And really, since everything can be bothness, there are times where categories are good, there are times where categories are bad, there is times where thinking is good, there are times when it is not. How do you ever determine? Well, it seems to be the question of what is in service of the that. What is in service of the encounter of the limit? What is keeping you from the encounter of the limit, and what is not? And only you can know, because as and then I'll give it to Ebert and Javier, because as only every family can have their sadness following Mr. Tolstoy, there's a way in which only you can have your limit. Only you can have your thatness, and no one else can have it. And yet you need to get really good at this thing, because there's something important about this. But let me give it to Mr. Ebert and Javier Rivera. Mr. Ebert, it is good to see you, sir. I hope you are well.
I'm good. I'm going to try and remember everything I wanted to say. Let's see. This is in the context of problematizing negative pragmatism. Let's say that, as Daniel says, avoiding reaching a limit is some sort of fear-based, neurotic fear of death. Fear of death because what occurs upon the limit, as far as I'm concerned, and freak theory says, and so on and so forth. By the way, to have a limit, to reach a limit, means that you find yourself within an interiority. A limit necessarily is a limit that limits an entire process, not just a part of it. Otherwise, the process wouldn't feel limitation. It would just run off infinitely in the other direction. So when we talk about limit, we're talking about a limit that encompasses the entirety of a process. What is something that encompasses something? It's a boundary which creates an interiority space. Now, when you exceed that limit, or when you come up against that limit, the discovery of the limit occurs precisely at the moment of interior saturation. A process occurs with enough quantitative procedure that the limit is encountered. So I'm playing drums, and finally there is a threshold beyond which all of a sudden I know how to play drums. And at that point, the saturation is phenomenologically identifiable vis-a-vis its absence. So the experience of mastering the drums is the experience of no longer thinking about the fucking drums, right? It's the point at which the process becomes indeterminate and recedes to the background of the subconscious. So when we talk about negative so this is why the idea of, and by the way, the moment you know that point is going to occur, the surprise is within the temporal arrangement of that limit. You don't know when it is going to be that you suddenly become a master, but it will happen. You just don't know when it's going to happen. And that's the surprise element. That's why it's sort of a trans-deterministic world when we think in temporal terms. Because there's a certain determinism, we figure, well, eventually I'll become a master, but the indeterminate aspect is both in the temporal arrangement of that moment and then the experience of that determinate act receding into the indeterminacy of automaticity, the automatic operations of the being. So we think that approaching limits is a positive. Now, when we think about negative pragmatism, I just keep, wanting to remind us, like, negative against what? We can be negative against the indeterminacy of that interiority, where we are saying, for instance, let's think about it this way, because this is all language, and this is all the phenomenology of rhetoric. When we say something, when I tell you something like, well, this is non-dynamical and this is a dynamical life, a non-dynamical life versus a dynamical life, which do you choose? You're going to go a dynamical one, because that's alive and that's vital. Well, if you're only choosing a dynamical life, guess what you're doing? Avoiding limits. Okay? Because the indeterminacy is precisely a description of a non-dynamical state. So in order to reach a limit, you create an indeterminacy which removes the very dynamism which classified your becoming. You are now being, right? If you want to put it in very simple terms, one is a becoming a master, and the other is a being a master. When you be a master, motherfucker, right? There's no dynamism to the mastering. You have mastered. And now that process is non-dynamical. And in fact, that is what qualifies it as a success. It is no longer, oh, I really am trying, I'm dynamically oscillating between novice and expert. No, from now on, you are just this infinitely uniform state of mastery. And that is the encounter with limit. So now I ask you again, what do you want to live as? Non-dynamical or dynamical? And you say, well, shit, now I don't know, actually, because I want to be able to master things. I want to encounter limit. And so I guess I have to embrace the non-dynamical phenomenological state. And now you say, okay, let's go back to negative pragmatism. What are we being negatively pragmatic about? Are we going to say that the non-dynamical state is bad because it's non-dynamical, therefore non-vital? And so we're going to constantly try and disrupt the stasis of the non-dynamical state? Or do we say, no, we're going to be negatively pragmatic about avoiding non-dynamism, which is neurotic? An avoidance of non-dynamism is an avoidance of death, right? Of a kind of death. And so we're going to say, no, we're going to be negatively pragmatic because pragmatism is really all about hitting those non-dynamical states and how to expedite the process of becoming a master. And so we're going to delay that process or expedite the process. Either way, the negative pragmatism thing contradicts itself, depending on which way you look at it, right? So whether it is the notion of taking the scenic route versus the freeway and elongating the process of becoming that leads to being, so elongating the process of being the student, having a student mind and so on, and all of that, or it is the or all of a sudden the scenic route looks like a neurotic ploy to evade arrival, right? So either way, we're caught in this sort of like a flip-flop. I wanted to say also just about love, I sort of put my foot down that love is the phenomenology of reunion, and it's really nothing else. And anything else, if someone was to tell me love is forgiveness, I'd be like, that's propaganda. You have instrumentalized love to achieve a certain end. Now, again, like, what is reunion? It's first of all reunion and union. So okay, so there was a prior union, and now I'm experiencing a reunion. What was the first union? Well, it was probably the womb, according to me, and maybe Freud, and maybe Lacan, and maybe some others. But it's the womb. Now, is there love in the womb? Probably not, because it's pure interiority. It's not a reunion, and it's not a feeling. You have no reference point. You have no difference. But if you experience the phenomenology of reunion, what you're experiencing is a re-interiorization occur, where suddenly you're like, okay, the interior that I had, that I've been long drive, that's the premise of drive, is it constantly trying to reach these states of inert or inertia or stasis, which is essentially the saturated interior again, which is inert and static. And so when you're with someone and you suddenly feel unified, and by the way, I don't follow Bard or anyone else. It's like, it's impossible to be to experience union. That is to totally misunderstand the dialectic, and it's a very sort of like, it's a very death drive thing to say, but it's 100% antithetical to the phenomenology of being in love, and we can't simply discard it. We tend to discard things that don't last precisely because we're so wounded by their transitory nature. And so, well, the feeling of love didn't last, and so it's not real. Well, it's like, well, okay, that's a cope. It was real, it did happen, and it didn't last, and you need to get over that aspect because nothing lasts. And when we experience the interiority, whether it's our own interiority or someone else's, I think it was Guy just now describing like maybe the interiority of a child, essentially. When we can really experience the interiority of someone else, we experience a sort of reunion. because we're experiencing their unity. And if we can look into the and I think that that's what the beautiful and actual mechanics of empathy is. And this is Hegel's whole point. It's the reason why A equals B. It's not because there's some aspect of B that equals A. It's that A is so much itself and B is so much itself in its interior. It is so saturated as B as such that it is thereby in its interiority indeterminate, because it is self-same. As Hegel always says, it is a self-same interiority. It's a self-relating infinity. And mathematically, as we know in set theory, anytime you have one infinity matched with another, or one saturation or one indeterminacy matched with another, you have something that is isomorphic, essentially two sets that are equivalent. And so when you suddenly see some or feel someone else's interiority, there's a resonance, a one-to-one resonance, where suddenly you're like, ah, and you really grasp them in their mystery, because it suddenly relates and reminds you of yours. And then, of course, if you experience that with someone else and you guys create an interiority of two, there is a real unity there. It's a real phenomenological experience. Just because you don't actually end up back in a room, that's a very literalist and stupid way to think about, like, it's not possible to get back in the room. Well, actually, the experience of the womb is an experience. Whether or not it's a physical reality or not is irrelevant if you're studying phenomenology. So anyway, just wanted to say all that, and it's a pleasure to be here.
It is a pleasure to have you, Mr. Ebert. I'll pass it to Javier and then Cadell. And what you would say, so there's a few things, and it's very interesting because when you were talking about, and Guy mentioned this as well, with the interiority and the eating, and you want to eat something, Sloterdijk, Peter Sloterdijk, I think it's in Bubbles, really talks about this interesting history of the relation between sex and eating and wanting to eat someone, and how there's almost this kind of subconscious association of the desire to have them enter your interiority in a manner that doesn't actually destroy them or yourself, and that we have to go through life and figure out how to actually interact with interiorities in a manner that honors them. But that's really difficult, because then there's an other and there's another interior, and I love them so much I want them part of the interior. And there's something about learning that art of reunification that doesn't devour. And it's very interesting. He also talks, there's a section in there I'll talk about in a minute, where he talks about the history of the placenta, and how one of the issues is that we've forgotten thinking about the womb. Like, the American individualism thinks about the womb without this other that is there keeping you alive. They talk about, like, all of these societies that honor the placenta and these rituals of the placenta and eating the placenta and all these different things as a certain testament of a radical individualization actually not being possible. And really what it means, what he's getting at, is the problem is a lot of times when we try to, in a sense, return to the womb, we're trying to, as an individual, get to a place where we're safe, where we don't have to worry about the outside world or difficulty, when really the funny thing is that what he's kind of pointing at is the revelation that actually the womb state would be found with another that you are with, and you're never actually separated. And that you can't actually, because he also is like emphasizing how we're always wombing beings. We're always creating spheres, whether it be bubbles, whether it be globes, whether it be, he talks a lot about humans as interior makers. I think you would enjoy his work quite a bit, Mr. Ebert, because I was thinking, his work on spheres makes me think of freak theory quite a bit. And it seems like the issue is that when we talk about returning to the womb, or trying to return to a kind of state of self-sameness, we do so in a manner that does not have another involved, that may even have to sacrifice itself, like the placenta does, right? So it becomes an interior space that doesn't have anything to do with difficulty. And that seems to be the kind of myth, if you will, that is problematic. But when we think about human beings actually seeking states of indeterminacy that are actually filled with a possibility of an oscillation or a dimorphism, or can break back into a dimorphism, and that for Sloterdijk has something to do with remembering the role of the placenta, then we're not actually trying to avoid otherness or difficulty. We're actually seeing reunification. Like, reunification is active, right? You can't just start in reunification. There has to be a ring that is part of it. So it's very interesting how he talks about the placenta. I need to expand on that. And the last thing I was going to say on that example of non-determinate, and you're choosing, if you become like a master, it's non-determinate. If you're not a master, it's non-determinate. To me, That's where I always come back to this absolute choice, because I think there's such a radicalness, like that story of the donkey, between the Burdian ass or donkey, between two equally sized piles of grain. And the question is, you know, and the donkey actually dies because it can't make a rational choice because both are equal, right? Like both are the same. So it requires a non-rational choice, as I call it, so that the donkey doesn't die because the piles are the same. I think that is really important, if dare I say, for life, to realize in the end you make a choice that you can't necessarily say is the better, or yeah, you become a master, but then you're bored with being a master. Yeah, you become famous or world expert, and then there's pathologies. Yeah, you're a novice and you never achieve anything, and then you're pathological about that. Everything brings with it all of its surprises and difficulties. But did you make the choice? I think that's what, if I were to, I suppose, make a harder stand in a way, I suppose what I would say is that we ought to, when we find ourselves confronted with being that Burdian donkey, in the encounter, not the idea, but in the encounter, and we find ourselves presented with an absolute choice that we cannot make appealing to something external, just ourselves, we ought to choose. What should we choose? Well, hard to say, but ought you to choose rather just stand there like a donkey and starve because you never want to make a choice or anything like that? That seems to be what we want to choose. We want to choose, and come what may, versus starve between those piles. That's something that I think about when I emphasize the absolute choice, because I think the point you're making out on both sides, there's a certain isomorphic structure there, but did you choose one of those isomorphic structures actively versus just kind of slip into it? Because I think that's what usually happens. I think most people just slip into one or the other without any kind of active choice. And they would have ended up in the same isomorphic structure whether they didn't choose or not. But there's something about that act of choice that I think is important. Now, that would require a lot of claims and a lot of writing, but I think about that a lot. But let me give it to Javier. Yes, Mr.
Can
Eber.
I just I forgot to say two things. One was just about status, because I'm big on that. And status, it comes in two basic flavors, which also relate to this, which is interior and exterior. And of course, there are, life and society is basically composed of nested interiorities that basically are perceived as nested hierarchies. And they're all over the place. You're in this club, you're not in that club. That club is actually an interiority of this club. So you get into the club, but then there's the VIP section and so on. And basically status anxiety, the anxiety being kicked out of the club you're into or not getting into the next club, basically runs, that is the invisible hand. So it's quite important in terms of structuring society. And of course, it engages the ego to the extent that we can say the ego has anything to do with existential risk and sort of calculating our survival. And then the last thing I just want to say, I see a lot of conversation about mastery. I haven't looked at it yet, but just want to keep in mind what I'm referring to when I say when I'm describing the dialectic of mastery. I'm referring to phenomenology. So much like when I'm saying that well, I'll just stick with mastery, that we've all probably had the experience, I know I have, of really working at something, and then all of a sudden we do something and we look back at it, and let's say there's a recording of it, and we listen back or we hear back or we look back or whatever the case, we read back and we're like, holy shit, that's dope. That's a master. But you didn't realize that you were doing masterful shit while you were in it. And the reason you didn't recognize it while it was happening is because it was self-absent to you while it was happening. You could call that the zone. You can call it whatever you want, pop cultural sort of like rhetoric. But it's the absence of, wait, is this right? Is this what I'm saying? Is this the thing? Is that the right word? Is this the right thing to say? Is that the right thing? That's a determinate experience of interacting with determinate objects, where you're in a mode of problematicity with regard to the very items you're using to communicate. So let's say it's words, right? If you've ever spoken in a language that is not your native language, you experience this all the time. You're constantly questioning whether or not the thing you are saying is the thing you mean, right? So it's not second nature. And then all of a sudden you master that language and suddenly realize like you're no longer thinking about what you're saying. And that's the process of mastery, whereby the behavior itself becomes implicit as opposed to explicit. It is no longer a determinate process with regards to your conscious experience of it. Anyway, cool.
No, outstanding. I think that's very, very important. And I'll pass it to Javier and then Cadell. And yeah, and I should also just note with that placenta example, it's kind of like, you know, if we think about people who kind of go to the apartment, like in Japan, and they never leave, it's like, oh, they're returning to the womb. We all know there's a big difference between that and returning to the apartment with another person. And what Sloterdijk is like, he's like, the problem is we forget that in the room there's a placenta, there's another. And so we're thinking about it as a kind of myth of isolationism, when really that's never what human beings have. You are always in this negotiation of reunification or being with. And that is very possible. I think that's talk about the harmony when you're talking about the master track, when you're like so much in the zone that your harmony with the art and there's a kind of self-forgetfulness that comes with that. That's a very real thing. And the results of it can become very, very powerful. And I think that then, I think in the same way that when you're like guys talk about seeing the baby, in a way you're in the zone of the baby when they're beautiful and not merely cute, right? You're in the zone of the conversation. It kind of goes away. And that's very, very possible. But that is from a certain, to use your language, saturation of activity versus going in the apartment and avoiding activity, if you will, or avoiding the other person. And it's interesting to think if exactly that kind of getting into the zone is possible without a feeling of something that is beyond you. Like the baby feels like it has an interiority beyond you, or the music or the art feels like it kind of exists in an interiority beyond you, precisely because you are able to engage with it by a kind of self-forgetfulness. Precisely because you were able to enter into a certain flow, that it feels like there's a certain life that is active beyond you, and that you got to participate in. And that then is the question of what exactly we can do to be kind of participating in that, et cetera, so forth. But let me pass it to Javier, Cadell, and Mr. Luber. Javier, please.
Yeah, I mean, I actually liked it when Ebert called it a contradiction. Because I was thinking, this idea of, well, what's better, the non-dynamic state or the dynamic state? I think the negative pragmatism position would be, you don't fucking cope it. You don't fucking cope it. You don't avoid either state. I think the question then becomes is when you're in whichever interiority, the non-dynamic or the dynamic, there's always this fucking temptation to avoid it. And I think it's right there where I would say, which is kind of ironic, really, because the moment you get in either state, there is a weird position where it's kind of non-determinate or indeterminate, where you're like, I don't fucking know. Should I continue with this? Should I not continue with this? Should I want to be in this non-dynamic state? Should I want to be in the more dynamic state? There's this real position right here where I think maybe the non-pragmatic position is fucking write it out until the encounter arises or something surprises you, right? And gives you sort of some kind of answer, right? And actually the surprise might actually be something like what you pointed out, Ebert, in your relation to master, was like, oh shit, yeah, actually that was really masterful when I look back on myself in the past. Like that's like a really I mean, to me, I think that's like a really interesting way. I mean, I do think when it comes to these two positions, do I want a more dynamic state? Do I want a non-dynamic state? I do think the negative part is simply abiding within the state to allow itself to eventually override itself, become something else. But at this point, I feel like I'm not saying anything fucking different from like what the Buddhists say. Fucking let go, and if you can't let go of that, well then fucking let go of that. Like let go that you can't fucking let go. So I mean, I don't know at this point. Like, this is the part where like I find myself in this funny position advocating for negative pragmatism, then I realize like it's just fucking like, just what Hegel already saying, or what Buddhists have kind of already said with just let go of that shit, then let go of the fact that you can't let go. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
No, I think it's excellent. I'll give it to Cadell and Luber. I think, I'm thinking a bit now about the indifference, Hegel's indifference, this idea of a kind of indifference of choice. I mean, I'll tell myself, like, I guess for me, when I think about why do you write? Why do you do philosophy? Why do I talk with such lovely people as yourself? It's the role, because I chose it. I chose it. And then there's a commitment to it. And then come what may. And there's something about that that I think is important. Because if you say, well, because I'm writing to publish books, or to have good ideas, I think it's like, because you chose it. You chose it. And then that's that. And you commit to it. Because it would seem as if, I guess to me, the raw choice, the absolute choice that then you commit to allows some sort of regularity that then things can disclose themselves in a way they otherwise cannot. There's something about the absolute choice that makes the possibility of disclosures that otherwise cannot occur. And then what I would also say on the Buddhist point with the letting go, I think, like, again, with the placenta stuff that I keep bringing up, because why not talk about the placenta? It's such a great topic, is that it's almost like there's a difference between the Buddhist letting go, not around anyone, and letting go in front of someone who thinks you're wasting your life. Like, there's a huge difference. Like, when you say, I'm going to be indifferent around people that are like, yeah, you ought to be indifferent. That's fine. But if I'm the indifferent or making an absolute choice around people who are pragmatists or optimized, it's one thing to talk about, say, negative pragmatism around other people who agree with it, but an entirely different matter to do it around people who think you're an idiot. And that is the negativity that seems to be the necessary component of this, so that the letting go actually has some necessary work on the subject. That seems to be that there's a huge difference between talking about detachment around people who are detached and detachment around people who think that's stupid. And this is where, to me, I think you're seeing, like, again, there is this kind of letting in Hegel, annihilation, annihilation in Heidegger. There's all these people like this kind of letting, this absolute choice. And that sounds very passive, but it's one of the hardest things in the world to do this in front of the gaze of the other, or with the other, or that puts the other at risk, or that the state's then coming for you, or something like that, right? But this seems to be getting at how we think this, like, because then there's negativity. It's then like, it's one thing, like, again, if you go back to the womb and there's another person in the womb who thinks you're stupid for being in the womb, or thinks this is a waste of time, that's very different from returning to the womb to avoid negativity, right? And that's like, there's a big difference between going to the apartment locked in with the gaze of the other, forcing you to work through things, and locking yourself in the apartment so that you can avoid the other, right? And that difference seems to be funny. It's funny because, in a sense, they look the same, but the difference is huge. And, but then, of course, because they look the same, we can always claim that we're doing the other when we're not. We can always claim that we're facing fear when really we're giving into anxiety. And and the fact that we can always do that means that it's kind of irrational not to do that, because you can always make it look like you're doing the thing that you're not, right? Why would you actually do the thing if you can make it look like you are without facing the negativity? Why would you actually face your, like, fear if you can just give into anxiety and convince people you're facing fear? Because you choose it, because you make the absolute choice and you stand by that. And I think then the work of philosophy is the conviction to the work of that choice. But let me pass it to Cadell and Mr. Luber. Cadell last. It is good to see you, sir. It is always a pleasure.
Yo. Great conversation, guys. So what's been on my mind throughout this conversation is a thread that actually started with Michelle. When Michelle asked, did Jesus have a woman moment when he asked, do you love me, to one of his disciples? And so I've been thinking this through. And I think it's also related to what Thomas Jock and I believe was talking about or also mentioned in regards to asking if the other person is okay, or if you're having a good time, that it's about you. You said that, right, Thomas? Yeah, okay. Yeah, so I wanted to connect that as well. It's the same basic gesture, this asking another person, do you love me? Are you having a good time? Are you okay? this type of thing, and is this a woman moment? What it made me reflect on was the first time I had the courage to talk to my high school crush. I was absolutely terrified. And of course, I had been playing the script in my head of what I wanted to say when I finally had a chance to talk to her. But I ended up freezing completely, of course. So I was not prepared. My plan was not enough, and I was not prepared. And basically I started asking her, is this a good conversation? And then I remember the first date with my first girlfriend. I because she was my first girlfriend, I thankfully survived this mess. But on my first date with her, I asked her after a few hours, is this date going well? And she responded, it was going well until you asked that, which was the precise, correct thing to say, looking back on it. But all of this made me think about also another idea Thomas had about the Platonic idea of beauty, where Jockin was saying the idea of beauty penetrates you, and that you can't get a safe distance from it, like a scientific stance, from it. So I had this idea that that maybe this is a clue that when a young man approaches a woman in love, he's approaching in a penetrative stance, like he's going to penetrate the woman, like psychologically, like in some sense this is going on. And it could be that the man is surprised, caught by surprise, that in going to penetrate the woman, he finds himself being penetrated. Which that's the surprise that the young man can't really comprehend, can't compute. Like, oh my God, I'm being penetrated here. This experience of beauty and aesthetics that you can't get a safe distance from. And I thought that made a lot of sense also as a critique of science, in regards to, like the stereotype of the nerdy physicist who knows everything about the fundamental nature of reality but can't talk to women. Like this is exactly going on and I think that actually might have like implications for like quantum gravity. Who knows? Like, who knows? That might actually have that might have implications for quantum gravity. I'm always trying to find links there to a subjective theory of quantum gravity. Is there anything else that's like super essential to say? Yeah, okay, so one more thing. I was thinking also in relationship to this about the principle of the relationship with my wife, because I have the precise inverse principle of asking, is everything going okay? Like the inverse principle. So like when I feel like things are not going okay, and specifically the feeling is, this is the feeling, I don't know if I always talk about this, but I don't know if you guys have the same experience, is that feeling where you want like a telekinetic power, like you just want the other to know what you're feeling without speaking about it. Like, and whenever this moment comes up in my relationship, I force myself to speak, but I force myself to speak not by asking, is everything going okay for her, but basically saying, I'm feeling insert negative term. So I own the negativity. I'm feeling insert negative term, and I don't know how to talk about this. And then, the real struggle then is basically trying to talk about how I'm feeling about insert negative term without projecting it onto her, but keeping it as an internal self-contradiction. And then by keeping it an internal self-contradiction, usually that prevents like an intimate partner fight, because I'm sort of, as it were, fighting myself. So it doesn't have to become an intimate partner fight. And then one final point, that this approach, this practice, I don't know if it might be the same as negative pragmatism. This approach might be the ground for a commons. And I want to distinguish capitalism from commons. And specifically on the level of I had this idea when doing the workshop in Brussels with Dave on time, energy, and the commons. I proposed to Joris, because Joris, who hosted us, he's a great guy, by the way, Joris de Kelver, he's working in the commons, and in talking to him about his like day-to-day experience, it seems like what his job is in the commons is just to hold negative affect of people's big ideas. Because people go to people go from capitalism to the commons because they have all these big ideas about utopian social organization. But the only thing that's coming for you in the commons is negativity, you know, like that's the only thing that's going to greet you. And what you're basically finding out as a capitalist subject is that and I think someone else also mentioned this earlier, I forget who, so I apologize for not remembering who. But we basically use money to get people to do what we want so that we don't have to speak through desire. But precisely the skill that's at stake in the commons is that you can speak through desire. And desire is by nature antagonistic, because my desire, your desire, and Joris is mediating a commons with 20 different houses, like 20 different people, 20 different houses, 20 different families. Imagine the conflicts of desire. You know, so I was just thinking that the people who are going to survive and like the people, where does a hierarchy come in the commons? I think a hierarchy comes in the commons by who can hold the greatest negativity. Whoever can hold the greatest negativity will by nature be the most valuable because they'll be able to mediate the most differences. Okay, I think that's basically all I wanted to say. Yeah, that's basically all I wanted to say. Great conversation, guys.
Well, thank you for being here. That is outstanding. I think this notion of this emphasis, I can definitely say, like, when you feel like reflecting on that negative affect, that's a big deal. And there's something kind of like decentralization about that, where you pull it inward versus let it kind of spread. And also what you were just saying at the end there, it cannot be overstated. When you look at Tocqueville democracy in America, when you look at the formation of the caste system in Louis Demande, Homo Hiragatasis, when you look at even under the Cultural Revolution, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all of these are examples that a lot of the things that have led to, say, reductionism or control or power are a result of people fleeing from negativity. Like, that's what ends up happening. Tocqueville talks about that all the time. It's like when you're on the West and people are like, oh, crap, well, let me talk about my job, because I don't know how to talk about negativity. I want to avoid that. So the thing about capital, we can critique capital all day, but capital allows a way for people to interact without going through that negativity. So if you want to move beyond these reductionisms, if you will, you have to gain the ability to hold negativity. Not have good ideas about how the world's going to be great, but holding of negativity. And here's the other key. The more you're dealing with pluralism, the greater the difficulty to hold negativity. That's the trick. Like when you have people who are similar, let's say everyone's Christian, you want to do a commons. Okay, it's still going to be hard, still going to be crazy hard, but there's enough similarity, like unspoken background, to make the negativity more manageable. The more and more you start incorporating difference, the more and more the negativity becomes really difficult to hold. It requires a subject that is very skillful and able. I like that term, Steve, metabolizing on it. That requires a certain training, though, and you cannot, the greater the diversity, the more difficult it is to hold people together through just negotiation is the term in belonging again. The more and more you need to move to a system, and what a system is something that works without the human element. It just works regardless the negotiation of the human element. But the problem with a system is that it works without the human element. That's the good and the bad. That's why you get the alienation and all the things, right? But otherwise, you need to be masterful at negotiation and talking, which is freaking hard and has a lot of holding negativity. So I think what you were saying is huge. And also as a little note, and then I'll give it to Luber and Javier, and then, you know, I have another 20 or so minutes. This has been delightful. If anyone has any final things to say, I've really enjoyed this. But as you were talking about this funny thing of how the scientist knows all about quantum mechanics, but they're not able to talk a girl. I'm thinking about how philosophers can tell you what's right, but they can't write a law. Like, they can tell you all day long about what is right and how the world should work. It's like, well, create a policy then. No, can't do that. Like, do something political. No, not going to do that. So, you know, it's funny. how like the pot, like I guess I was just thinking how the scientist to the girl can sometimes be like the philosopher to the political. All the more reason to take the class starting on the 18th. Philosophy
I
of
knew
right,
you were.
baby.
I knew you were doing that.
I was
knew
saying it.
you were
Yeah,
doing
starting
that.
up. Go to Philosophy Portal. Sign
So
up,
clever.
everyone. Let me give it to Mr. Luber and then Javier Rivera. Mr. Luber, it is good to see you, sir. I hope you are well.
I wish I was here for the entire conversation, but everything that I did here was great. It was really, really good. It just made me think a lot of different things, per usual, with being here at the net, the curse. So I guess the first thing that I have in mind is just that I'm reading. So you brought up systems. You brought up systems, and like I just been trying to personally just figure out like is the book that we wrote basically a system or not? Like, so per the recommendation of Sean, who sent me that Heidegger book on Schelling's something freedom, I'm like reading that right now, and I'm reading Levinas's Totality and Infinity, and I'm just trying to think about basically the relationship between these three things right now: freedom, system, and transcendence. And I think a lot of what we were touching on basically has to do with those three things. So the first thing I want to say is I guess just to talk about how Heidegger understands system. Basically, he's saying that during the medieval period, there was no system. There were handbooks. They were beginner handbooks, more like how-to, essentially. I'm being crude. But he does refer to them as handbooks. And then in the ancient Greeks, he says they're technically not systems either. They think systematically, but how they present their information, how they take in the information, still isn't a system. They just, again, think systematically. And that he was basically saying that the only systems that are like true systems are Hegel's and Schelling. And he then went on to say that the reason why that's the case is because a system isn't something that's just necessarily generated by the individual, but the environment actually forces the system to emerge, and whatever individual is in the correct positionality basically takes it in and then just flushes it back out. So a system, in a certain sense, captures like the presence of hand, the present thing, and it captures the thing in itself. And that if you make a system, it applies to all possible systems. And that the difference between basically the system and then his analytic is just that Dasein's analytic isn't necessarily just capturing the presence at hand, it's also capturing the ready at hand. He is saying that an analysis, a descriptive analysis, is essentially more active than a system in a certain sense. But what you guys are making me think with like for example, like Javier, negative pragmatism, is that a system? Because it gives me system vibes. And but the thing is, how the system was discovered to me makes sense too. Like, it's just used as an example where it's just like I'm dealing with my partner, and in that experience, this thing just popped out and like kind of possessed me in a certain way. And so in that sense, it's just giving me like Heidegger system vibes, which isn't a bad thing or anything. But anyway, what I'm trying to get at is that there's like a different mode in systems versus more when we're talking about like active things that are happening in our lives. When we're telling a story, like Dall was just giving references about things in his past. Like there's a way where it's like addressing the system, but you're not actually like presenting it as a system. And that is making me think that there's a certain like mastery to the philosophy at hand when you can be so active in the way you're addressing and holding the philosophy that makes me think, and this is just going to what Eber was saying with like the master versus non-master stuff, where it's like it's not to like speak for Cadell or anybody. It's like, oh, I'm listening to the conversation and the way I'm processing it is I understand it so well that I can particularize what's being said in so much that I can tell a specific story to support what I'm saying. And like, I don't think you can do anything more than that like to show like a mastery of something in this context, in my opinion. So like, I think there's still like a certain phenomenological focus that brought someone to the ability to say a story, to show their understanding of the content at hand. And that to me just can't be being. It just can't be something that is this all-encompassing everything. It's like for Levinas, and this is where I feel like Levinas comes in. It's like for Levinas, it's transcendence is not necessarily like a good way of putting it is like not putting yourself in the other person's shoes. It's letting the other person just reveal themselves to you and you responding accordingly. Like you transcend in the reveal of the other. You don't transcend in totalizing the other in a certain sense. You see the other as infinity, and therefore you transcend and meet and match the other in understanding what they're expressing. And to me, in order to do that, there has to be a certain focus, patience, waiting, knowing how to wait, knowing how to take in, and knowing how to like spit back out that you are operating under that's different than if you're just putting yourself in like a non-transcendent position where you're just basically projecting your ego out and possessing the other with your own image. And I think we like, for me, this is where like storytelling comes in, because you have to like listen to the room. Like you have to listen to the room and then create an interpretation of the room, and then you have to operate within the room according to that interpretation. That is what storytelling is. And that is a different mode than pointing out, okay, like this is the point in which I can meet transcendence. Trying to think of like Ebert's language is great with this. I'm just not like fucking good like he is with talking about it like that. But basically, like there's a certain saturation. It's like, okay, like I've now become the mode of mastery. Like you are still operating in a certain like focus when you're in the master. It's just a different focus, and it's like an ongoing focus. And like that's just to tie it back to like that example with like Cadell in the story. I just think like that's not talked about enough. Essentially, like we talk about basically the preconditions so well to get to the point of talking about this true active state and how to be really, really active in philosophizing. And yeah, I'm kind of losing my thoughts, but I hope that made sense. And if it didn't, let me know, please.
You're a beautiful soul, Andrew Lugo. I'll pass it to Javier, and then if anyone has any final things before we go plant two final tomato plants that we didn't do, and we're trying to feed the deer. So we will see. I think it's extremely important to note that system building is quite rare, and I think also like when Cadell talks about system and subject. So there's like two things for me. There's everyone saying we don't build systems. Systems don't matter, which then makes them kind of high and mighty not to talk about anything political or law or anything like that. But then there's also system that doesn't care about the involvement of the subject, right? And this is where like the science of the subject or the systems and subject become very, very important today. Because if we're going to talk about, you know, this idea of commons, holding negativity, what does it mean to have a system of people that hold negativity, which means that they don't actually find the ability to project out of themselves negativity onto the system? Because that's usually what happens, is that systems are ways for people to avoid negativity. So what is a system that doesn't let you avoid negativity? In fact, if anything, it makes you have to face negativity, or maybe it makes it more difficult to run forward, or it's systematic about negativity, but not a system to avoid negativity, right? Those seem to be very different, and I wonder if there's something to the work where when system and subject come together, it's story, right? Like, you know, system and subject come together as story in a way, because it's the unfolding of the subject in a manner that's kind of following a procedure, but the procedure is not mechanical. It's a procedure that's inseparable from the movement of the character. And then the question is, okay, does the story have a theme? So a good system subject is going to help people move out of the ironic situation into something thematic. So what would it look like to have system subject that is thematic, right? Because there's also something funny with Hegel where it's like it's moving systematically to something that is always already an operation of the subject, right? Like that is always already there, and there's a realization of something that is always the case, and returning to the place of your beginnings to know it for the first time with the RE in parentheses, that then what Hegel understands is that we need to think that in order to then think in terms of logic or think the state. Right? So you have to think these things. And what we've done, I think, for most of history is basically emphasize the subject to avoid talking any sort of system, ergo state, ergo law, or we've talked about the state to avoid the subject and led to pathologies, right? So what would it look like to put those together? It has something to do with holding negativity. And I'm also thinking about with the telepathy example with Michelle and twins. The funny thing about telepathy and the partner just knowing what you're going to say without speaking them, it's as if you're getting the results of a system without a system. They just know what you're going to say, as if there was a system to assure it. Because when I say system, I have in mind results that are not contingent upon a human element. They're not contingent upon a negotiation. That's the greatness of them and the horror of them, right? And I'll give it to you, Mr. Luber, and then Javier, is the idea that, like, in telepathy, it's like, oh my gosh, it's as if there's a system, but there's not. It just happens. And that's what we all want. We want a politics without having a politics. We want a state without having a state. We want a system and like negotiation without the negativity of negotiation. And that's not good. But Mr. Luber, what was that, sir?
You're just making me think real quick. The few things. The reason why the philosopher can't write laws is because they're just so caught up in pointing out the irony in so many different ways that they actually they themselves can't be active enough to actually like take out the understanding of the irony and move it into like an active mode, basically. And then also just like you're just making me think like Heidegger was talking about like history in the book, and like he has this really great thing where he's like, you don't actually understand the origin of history. The key is you understand how history changes. The change is how you see the origin, not the origin itself. So like with the telepathy example, I'm sure it's like, okay, you're in a certain like situation, you're in the kitchen and Michelle is with her sister, and like something happens in the kitchen where Michelle can kind of anticipate exactly how her sister's going to change in the situation. And I think that to me is what telepathy is. It's not necessarily like understand, like it has nothing to do with the origin itself. It has to do with the remnants of the origin, which is like the always emerging change, the always emerging new external force that like incites the situation. But yeah, and then one more thing, Heidegger says in the book that basically system and freedom, they basically seem paradoxical, but a true system actually makes you free, is what he's saying. So I just think that just is because a system has to do with the always ever, like the always ever present change that will happen, and not so much a static, this is the origin, this is the beginning of the thing, and that's where the system is positioned. it's not that. So yeah, sorry, I just wanted to.
No,
squeeze that in. Thank you.
that's excellent. I'll give it to Philip. I'll give it to Javier and then Philip. I mean, in the philosophy of right, there's this kind of notion where it starts off with an abstract freedom, where the role of the state, or we could say in this instance, the system, is to make you freely choose your determinations. When you're born, you find yourself facing things you didn't choose, and you're like, I shouldn't have to face these things I didn't choose because I should be free. Like your initial experience of determination is this ought to not be. So is an ought or split, right? Hegel says that, to be very general, a role of the state is to convince you that what is ought to be. Is and ought are two sides of the same coin then, and thus you're free. Because if what is what ought to be, then you feel free in it. And the question is, what is the role? How can the state operate in a manner to not split is and ought, but to actually have them together? Because then you find freedom in it, right? And this is where the philosopher is important. And I think it's a good point. I think there's something dangerous about saying philosophers should write laws, right? You know, there's something dangerous about that. But then maybe this is a way to put it. The philosopher can be afraid to say things that are actionable. They can be afraid to say things that can be done, or that could actually lead to policies or decisions, because then, oh gosh, I'd have to see the concrete results of my thought. Oh no! And we rather not. But let me give it to Mr. Rivera and Philip. Mr. Rivera.
I'm gonna try to share an antidote because this is really where I got the idea of negative pragmatism. And I have, like, I think I've been struggling to fucking articulate it. Really was what it is. So this idea would fall under actually a very similar situation to what Cadell shared. There's an interaction with like a partner or whatever, and you have this experience of negativity, right? And I chose to express it. But something that happened was we both shared our perspectives of the event itself that triggered this negativity, right? So basically I was upset over like a burnt burger or something, and like I couldn't rationally understand why I was, because I thought it was ridiculous that I was upset about being so, you know, like to me it's like there's no worse feeling than understand that you're upset for no good fucking reason. Really, right? But I was trying to deny this negativity. My partner's like, what's going on? And I was like, I don't know, I can't get over this event, like I can't get over it. And then she's like, okay. So we went on a walk, and I just walked her through like my perspectives, like everything that I subjectively captured as this event happened. And then she did the same in turn. And what ended up happening was my understanding of the event changed. And then we got to this one question where it was, okay, so like, what do we do? And it was just like, I don't know. I feel like it resolved itself. Like, you know, it's like it already, there was nothing to do, really. Because it was weird, because like we're trying to mitigate each other's stress or something like that, and we're trying to like do useful and helpful things for each other, and then all of a sudden you get to this moment of just like, I don't know. But weirdly enough, this whole interaction, this kind of reconfiguring of the event that sparked the negativity, really kind of resolves the whole thing without resolving the whole thing. You know what I mean? Like, you didn't do anything useful. There was nothing useful being done, other than maybe you shared a perspective, and you could say, well, that's useful. Sharing each other's perspectives is useful. But the question is, when you ask each other at the end of the day, okay, what do we do? There was no answer to this. There was no like actual quote quote resolution per se, other than the negativity gained a perspective, right? So yeah, that's all I'm trying to articulate. And when I had that experience, I was like, yeah, that's it. That's negative pragmatism. Whatever that is, that's what it is. When we go at the end of it, I don't know, but yet ironically something resolved. But yeah, I'll leave it there.
Delightful. I'll give it to Philip before closing out. And I mean, what you could do is takeout or pizza. you know, don't cook burgers. No, it's funny. Before I forget, I meant to tell you this. On this war against optimization in a way, Samuel Barnes and Owen brought to my attention this craze on whatever that horrible thing, TikTok, of all these like managerial date night of our list of our goals. And it seemed like the professional managerial class is defining people's relationships lives. And I have never, ever been more horrified. So, you know, I was like, oh my gosh, no, no. Good to see you, Mr. Jockin. And yeah, it's interesting because it's almost like when you get to the end of that conversation, which one speaks to a lot of kind of conversation and therapy psychoanalysis, where the very act of talking about something does something, where it's almost like there's something unique about these things. And Guy was here with circling and dialogue, you know, all these different things. Where it's almost like when you talk about it, you go, well, what did we do? And it's like, what we did. Like, what did we do is what we did. And it's like, that's this weird moment where some of the most important things are the things that occur that then you ask, what do we do? And it's what you did. It's where do and did can like collapse, where there's some sort of different time that can't be reduced into, you know, cause and effect, because the cause is the effect. The process is the outcome. And I think basically in a world of, I will say this, and this is my major critique of like utilitarianism, which would fall on pragmatism, is the only things that are real are the things that have results, when often the things that matter most cannot be separated from the process. They are not results. They are arts that are done. They may have products, but the products are secondary. There are things that, whatever the products are a product of a kind of self-forgetfulness that then occur. Because yeah, I think that like you did do something, you talked about it, but the outcome was the talking about it. And that actually did something that you didn't expect. And I think a lot of philosophies like that. Like, what's the point of philosophy? What are we going to do now? What we did, because the transformation has occurred. And like, what are we going to do? It's what we did. But let me give it to Philip here. Philip Shen.
Daniel, you've horrified me with your wisdom. I need to now. I thought for a while what I needed to do was learn how to talk to girls. Now I have to learn how to write laws. I think I missed the mark there. There's three things I want. I just want like your take on how these might be woven together towards whatever you want to call the good life. I think it's like the Nicomachean ethics where Aristotle puts contemplation as the highest good. And then Meister Eckhart comes along and says, the active life is a respite from the contemplative life. So use that as the break. And then, Hannah Arendt tries to say, the active, the contemplative. How do you see the philosophers? Because all three of these would suggest kind of a move toward the spiritual, and how then might that relate to the writing of law as well as
Well, that's a tremendous question with some of the Hannah Arendt and Aristotle and Master Eckhart. I think it's good to see everyone. I think so. There's a real emphasis in Aristotle on habits and the formation of certain habits that then are virtuous, which I think we can align with that idea of where is and order together, where you make a habit of the things that is, and part of that habit is to see what is as what ought to be. And this is actually quite active. And there's a way in which if you take Aristotle and put it together with Master Eckhart, what you're doing is moving. The action is observation. The issue is you can have a form of contemplatio that is, I have in my head what I need to contemplate to get to kind of the forms, right? Now, that's kind of a cheap generalization, but I think it's fair because there's a notion that the idea is the form and so on and so forth, right? And the active sort of notion that is brought into is that, no, there's this kind not that I'm any expert on Master Eckhart, but what I take Master Eckhart to really stress, like if I think of one of the sermons that Guy was actually talking about, there's this idea that the more you are fed by God, the hungrier you become. Actually, it's the exact opposite of most food, which is, well, usually when you eat food, you then don't want any more. Like eating makes you less hungry. But the idea of God is apathetic, is that the more of God you eat or experience, the more you actually become hungry, and you get this very positive feedback loop. So the contemplation then actually becomes more hungry to do itself. It is very active and it's very alive. And in that, it pulls it, like if we're bringing it to Hannah Arendt, in that it would pull you into the realm of action or the social from outside of the political, right? Because you're then hungry. You don't ask anymore. This would be the trick. You don't really ask anymore, what's the utility? Because utility, by definition, has to have a kind of saturation point, to use Mr. Ebert's language. There has to be a point, like, I'm eating food to not be hungry. The moment you start talking about eating something that makes you more hungry, it can't be utilitarian. It can't be a matter of saturation, and it can't be utility. You would never. It is very impractical to eat something that makes you more hungry. That's stupid. That's not practical at all. But Master Eckhart is suggesting that the point of the human being is to do something that generates its own drive, if you will. And so, and then if we tie that to Hannah Arendt, basically action to escape capture and to produce its own line of flight would require an orientation of the subject to do that of which eating makes them more hungry, right? And that then would, the question would be the following. What exactly are the laws, institutions, structures of school, structures of government, structures of society of which are able to incubate some sort of habit of people that would make them do something of which doing makes them want to do it more, and it not be oppressive, not be in the realm of system, but actually something that emerges from the human negotiation with other human beings that thus can be located in the commons, because this is what would be required for a commons to not become self-destructive. Belonging again too goes on forever. And it gets into things like freeing of speech. It gets into moving to actually interactions of the human being that are cultivating beauty, that are actually like conversation is big because there's something about conversation that is unique in creating its own drive. Lacan, conversation creates drive. We need to make education about training speech, which is to say training action versus getting a job. Conversation, action, activity, like habit, these become the drive of education, not a pragmatic result. It means you delete the college monopoly of credentials. It means you remove certification as we know it, things we talked about last time. But to me, all three of those thinkers, if we take Aristotle, Master Eckhart, and Hannah Arendt, all three of them are speaking about some sort of, dare I say, network effect. Some sort of cybernetic network effect that the technology and infrastructure did not exist at their time. So Aristotle is going to talk about contemplatio relative to a polis, really, like a small community where everybody knows one another. And basically, here's the thing. In a polis, the majority of people don't do philosophy, right? The majority of people don't do philosophy. So it is very unlikely that interaction is going to help with contemplatio. Actually, it's probably going to get in the way of it. So activity would likely, given that sociological structure, not help with philosophy. And in fact, would probably get you sucked into busyness or different things, right? Master Eckhart is writing in a time where the contemplatio tradition has been captured by the institutions of the church. And actually, the things you are contemplating are preset by the dogma of the church, because we know what God is. So contemplatio is now in service of totalitarianism in a way. So Master Eckhart is like, no, it needs to be based on the apathetic. But here's the trick. The moment you base thought on the apathetic, by definition, it is going to have to be active because it can never settle. And it has to move beyond thought in some pretty profound ways, because if it's in thought, then that's the temptation of making the apathetic capathetic. You start moving with something much more dialectical and something that looks much more like drive and a wheel in a self-turning wheel. But here's a problem. At that point, it is still the case. It is difficult to have, say, conversations like this. It is still very difficult to find other Christians who are apathetic to talk. In fact, they think you're a heretic and they're going to banish you. So you're probably not going to be able to engage an apophatic orbiting that is relational. It is still going to be more isolationist, just like the contemplatio of Aristotle, as forced also by the demonization of the church, right? Okay, well then, but then Hannah Arendt comes along and she's saying, well, we got to avoid that Nazism. We better not do that. Oh, crap. It looks like the intellectuals were part of the problem. Just actually, if you're smart, you are more likely to be a Nazi. That's not good. But wait a minute. The only alternative is the logic of capital, right? So what we need to do is recover some sort of contemplatio apophatic tradition, because I believe she'll talk about people like Augustine and Eckhart and different people like that. But it also can't be captured by the market. But if it's inactive, here's the key now. If it's inactive, then the Nazis are coming because you can't stop them, right? You know, if it's inactive in a kind of Master Eckhart way, then you might not be able to do much about Nazism, right? So how do we bring a kind of civic, because there is a kind of question of what does it mean to be a political philosopher for Hannah Arendt without sacrificing philosophy for politics. And I believe Hannah Arendt was hesitant to even call herself like a philosopher in different things like that, you know, because it's this kind of idea that you need to do something philosophical without reifying the categories of philosophy that either contributed to totalitarianism or were not able to stop it, right? So all three of those, in my opinion, leave us with a question, something that has not really been done, if you will, because I do think the infrastructure and technology was not there to do it. Basically, the Zoom tradition we've talked about many times, the freeing of speech, this. I think this, the liminal web, would actually, in a way, be the sublation of those three. And I think the reason why is that the web, what we have to realize is that conversations like this, like we can talk all day about, oh, man, you know, philosophies like conversations like this, they're so irrelevant. They have nothing to do with people's lives or so on and so forth. Finding people who have conversations like this is insanely difficult, like incredibly difficult to find people that want to have philosophical conversation. So relational philosophy is incredibly rare. And when it happened, it changed the world, right? Bloomsbury, Goethe, Vienna Circle, the Randall Collins stuff, right? But the conditions of relational philosophy, if you just grant me that language, have always in history been stupidly rare, right? But when they have occurred, they have had epoch-forming possibility, right? The liminal web helps us deal with the sorting information coordination problem of philosophy. Von Mises, with the pricing mechanism, shows us how pricing can deal with the coordination problem of resources, but Zoom can help us deal with the coordination problem of philosophy. And now that we're able to deal with the coordination problem of philosophy, the network effect of philosophy that makes possible a kind of action that Hannah Arendt is talking about, that is also incorporating the Eckhart and the Aristotle, now becomes possible. And so the question is how to scale the infrastructure that makes possible philosophical coordination. Do you understand what I'm saying? So then the question is the following. How did you scale the pricing mechanism? There were laws, there were investments, the state did the different things. I would definitely have the government investing in internet. I would definitely have it investing in different classroom structures. But Philip, I knew what you're going to say. You were trying to say something. What was that, my friend?
Well, one of the advantages, I think, of the Zoom platform is a lot of people have a unidimensional conversation either around the state, the market, or the church. And like, you kind of need a lot of time to have those three in relation with each other, like simultaneously, and seeing all those different dynamics. Like, I can't see a time in the past couple hundred years, at least in the West, when they weren't like dynamically involved and people were going, it's all this one node's fault. The other, no, it's all the church's fault. No, we're all going to become Nazis. And sometimes it even seems like when capital is in an ascendant position, you could even conceptualize it as being like, but aren't there like certain monotheistic values driving capital? And it's like, well, that certainly opens up the conversation. And then it's like, well, who wants to have that while they're standing in line at the grocery store? They're like out with their friends on a Friday. You know, you bring that up and everyone goes, boo, we're going to talk about the sports.
Yes. What you just said cannot be overstated in its importance. It's a beautiful, exactly right. For most of history, the church and state could not interact without them becoming one another. And to the degree they would interact would be according to special interest groups, which would create your K Street and all these other issues, right? The same goes with the market in the church or the market in the state. It has been incredibly difficult to have them interact and speak about one another without it being professionals of one of them with their own interests speaking to the other, because how else would you know so much about the state to even be able to have that conversation unless you were a professional with vested interest in it? Now, because of the internet and the liminal web, it is literally possible to have conversations or relations or interactions between state, church, and market by the public, because the public is the interacting body of those three, without having vested interest in any of them, which then makes possible a negation sublation that was deeply unlikely in the past. The capital nation state, the problem, Koratani is big. What does he talk about? The capital nation state. The key to dealing with the capital nation state is being able to talk about the capital nation state without being invested in one of those three. If you're not, you're invested in one of those three, and thus all three of them stay together. In order to make it visible, you have to have the Hegelian indifference to all three, but then you have to know enough about all three to be able to make them speak with one another. And who the heck is going to gain that much knowledge unless they're making money off of it? Crazy people on the liminal web, crazy philosophical people who are compelled by something. That makes possible a cross-pollination and a emergence of rhetoric that has not been possible, that would be bringing together those three into a negation sublation. And then all you have to do is accept the following premise. Language changes the world. What people talk about, what people discuss, changes the world. Is that true or is that false? If it is true, then we have what we need. If it is false, God help us. But if it is true, which there is very good reason to think it is true, based on Jonathan Rauch, Kindly Inquisitors, based on Dietrich McCloskey on the Bourgeoisie trilogies, based on The Faithful Presence, based on Randall Collins, based on all of these things, Habermas, we can keep going. There is extremely good reason to believe that merely the introduction of a new rhetoric, a new possibility of discussion, transforms the subject in a manner to make political realities possible that otherwise were not possible because the people involved in those political and social formations did not meet the conditions of being able to live them. Thus, they fell back on the logic of capital. Thus, they fell back into hierarchies of Louis Demond. Thus, they fell back into the distinctions and Tocqueville and all these different things. But now, it is possible for subjects to be conditioned in a manner where they actually are able to more so scale a civilization of negotiation versus system with pluralism versus keeping out pluralism, which has never happened, which would be small group dynamics on a global scale, to use Michelle Bowen's phrase. It is possible. There's reason to believe that it has been done. And here's also the key Hegelian move. In order to do this, we don't have to add anything. We just have to use what's already there. And for Hegel, that's critical. Because the moment you start saying, we need X, we need to make Y, we need D, well, now you're in totalitarianism and good ideas. But if you say, we have Zoom, we have the internet, okay, how do we spread those? And how do we remove the laws that get in the way of the implementation of those and the people getting jobs based on those and the classrooms that make people associate doing this kind of thing with being immoral, the trivia classroom, right? All of these things exist. All of these things are there. These are not things that we have to create or force upon other people. What we need to do, and here's the other key Hegelian move, you're not adding, you're negating. You're negating laws that keep classrooms from being based on a conversation model versus a trivia model. You're removing the college certification on monopoly. You're removing moral associations of trivia with intelligence versus discussion. You're not adding anything, you're removing. Well, that actually is how revolution, in a sense, is possible without the unintended consequences of the French Revolution. Because you're not adding anything, you're creating clearings. You must, if you're going to change things, it must be by a logic of negation and clearing, not addition. Because the moment I have to add, I have to convince people of something that doesn't exist. And that necessarily creates self-sameness and homogeneity and removing pluralism. Because by definition, when I'm convincing people of something that doesn't exist, it's going to self-select to people who see the vision, which will always be a minority. But if I just have to spread what already exists to people who are already dissatisfied with what exists, oh, I don't have to convince anything. I just have to show, like the good artist. You change the world when there is something that can be shown versus something be enforced. And we have the tools to do that. And the question are the particular laws, etc., and so forth that need to be removed or reformed to make that possible. And hopefully Belonging Again Part 2 can do a good job of making that case. Wonderful question, Philip. I've enjoyed it immensely. Thank you, sir. All the best. Have a good one.